Hello everyone, I am the Macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. I will never forget that sound. The noise of rapid footsteps on dry leaves passing by my tent was so fast that it seemed to have been visited by an Olympic sprinter. It was midnight when it first happened. I took my pistol and searched the surrounding area, but there was no sign of anything. I tried to relax in my sleeping bag, but it had barely been 5 minutes when something ran again next to the shop. 10 minutes later I heard it again. Then I just waited anxiously for the sunrise. The desert had always been my refuge, my escape. When life got complicated, I've gone camping more times than I can count. Almost always just the truth. I don't get along with crowds. After many years traveling, I felt it was time for another visit to the outdoors. I had been researching for a while a new camping site located a few hours from the city. Online reviews were just fantastic. A perfect place for solo travelers, with enough space for each camper to pitch their tent without disturbing the others. It was exactly what I needed. With the essentials packed up, including my pistol to Sigu, I hit the road and finally made it to the reception of the place. Although some people enjoy the unknown, I prefer areas already prepared for campers. Yes, it had an entrance fee, but that gave me some peace of mind, knowing that I wouldn't end up in the territory of some madman with a shotgun. As I entered the front desk, I was hit by a feeling of emptiness, not because I was alone, but something more itive. Something inside me warned me that the place seemed to absorb my energy, as absurd as it can sound. I went to the counter and called for someone to attend to me. It was about 2 in the afternoon, and I knew that before I got to the camping site I would have to do a little hike as indicated by the map I saw hanging on the wall. I didn't have to wait long. A very old man wearing a blue sweater walked out the door of the back office. He had to be at least 90 years old, but he didn't behave like one. He spoke with the vitality of a much younger man, and his attitude was much friendlier than his stern appearance suggested. He explained the rules and regulations of the place to me, and then he started talking to me about the history of the area. I'm not rude, but adventure was calling me, and I was barely paying attention to what he was saying. Maybe I was too direct when I told him I needed to. I left. The old man seemed disappointed, even sad, but he didn't hesitate to guide me to the start of the trail. Before I left, he handed me a couple of keys that would open a door at the entrance of the forest. Finally, my escape could start. According to the map at the reception, the forest was just over 3 kilometers away, but it took me many more hours than expected to reach the huge trees I had seen in the photos on the website. At first I thought maybe my step was too slow, but I knew I was in good physical shape. I was surprised that the map was so bad, but I didn't give it much importance. By the time I got to the door, the sun was already starting to set in front of the metal barrier. I noticed that the fences on both sides extended as far as my eye could reach. Getting lost in the distance, I looked down at the line of giant trees, and beyond the door I saw the wild world I was eager to explore. I tried hard, but the key I had been given didn't work. Its shape didn't even match the lock. The strange elements of this trip started to build up, but I shook those thoughts out of my mind. And my thoughts would only slow me down. What I did next was probably illegal, but as I already said, I didn't have the energy to think of another solution. Fortunately, the door wasn't too high, so I threw my backpack to the other side and climbed to join my belongings. At that time I wasn't very picky about where I was going to camp. I looked for the first flat terrain move clear I found as I went through the towering trees. The last rays of the day shone between the branches. I stopped for a moment to appreciate the beauty of nature, but that short break gave me back the same uncomfortable feeling I had felt at the reception. My energy was quickly depleted, so instead of looking for suitable ground, I pitched my tent in the first space I saw and prepared a cooking area with a week's supply of beans ready to cook. I decided to lie down to rest before lighting the. I didn't plan to sleep yet, but as soon as I closed my eyes I fell fast asleep. I woke up suddenly with a sound that I will never forget. Something was running next to my tent. At first I thought maybe it was an animal, but the sound of human feet is very much of any four-legged creature. Whatever was there was moving on 2 legs. I got up immediately and left the tent with my flashlight and my pistol, but I didn't find any trace. I went back to the store, but the noise repeated 2 more times. Both times I hurriedly left to catch my mysterious visitor, but there was nothing sleepy that night. I didn't stop generating theories. A bear erect on its hind legs? No, that didn't explain the speed. If it was a human, what was I doing running in the middle of the forest at that time? I had no idea. But the most chilling thing was not the sound of the rustling leaves under the footsteps, but the absolute silence that remained afterwards, while I waited for the noise to return. The new morning brought with it more questions than when I left the store. I noticed the ashes of a campfire that had been extinguished. I had lit it before falling asleep. It made no sense, since I clearly remembered that I had not started the fire. Surely, if I had, I would have noticed it while looking for the intruder at midnight. Although I suppose at that moment I was too focused on the mysterious visitor, I knew that the best thing to do was to leave. I had planned to camp for 5 days. But after that strange night, a single day was already too much. The idea of walking back to the reception was overwhelming. But for the first time in my life, civilization was more difficult for me. Attractive than nature, while I was packing my things I began to feel sleepy again. It was because of lack of sleep, or there was something else in the environment yet. I don't know for sure. Luckily, I was used to operating with few hours of rest, so it was not difficult for me to pick everything up and get ready to leave. I was tired, yes. But with the gun strapped to my leg, I felt safe to take the road to. On my way back, I started following the path I remembered taking the day before. I swore I hadn't walked that deep into the woods, but after walking for over an hour I realized I must be wrong. I knew I was going in the right direction. I prided myself on my sense of direction, however. Something didn't add up. After a while more I began to notice something very peculiar. The landscape at my fingertips around seemed to repeat itself. At first I ignored it, but after a while I couldn't help it. I was walking in circles. I decided to time my steps every 12 minutes and 16 seconds. I passed by a huge redwood tree with a gray mark that was shaped like an eagle's head, and every 16 minutes and 11 seconds I passed by another tree that seemed to be in a state of decay. This was repeated over and over again for what seemed like hours. I tried everything I could think of. Change direction, walk in a straight line, move sideways, but nothing worked. I kept going, caught in the same endless cycle. My spirit was holding steady, but my body was starting to weaken. I finally fell apart among the dry leaves, exhausted. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised when the sound woke me up again, but I was still startled. But this time I didn't have the tent to protect me, although I knew that the thin fabric of the tent would not have defended me of nothing. Its absence made me feel completely unprotected. My instincts were immediately activated. I raised my pistol and lit the flashlight, crossing my arms in the classic combat posture, ready to face anything you were throwing me in the dark. The noises continued, and I followed the one of each sound. Turning this time to my back, I turned and fired 3 more times, but again, nothing. I repeated this pattern until I used up all 15 magazine rounds. For the first time in my life, I doubted my ability with a firearm. I had never failed that way before. My eyes and ears had never deceived me. I was a good shooter, and I prided myself on being able to hit a moving target from a distance, but there in that forest I didn't hit a single shot with each missed shot. My confidence was fading, and for the first time I felt that death was closer than I had ever been. Fear invaded me with my exhausted options. I decided to run. The sound of my boots hitting the ground was considerable, but I would swear I heard another couple of footsteps behind me, following me at the same speed. I don't know if it was an act God or simple luck, but soon I reached the closed door that I had swallowed in the woods. Just question why it was now open. I just pushed the door and ran towards the reception. I ran towards the reception without looking back, driven only by fear and adrenaline. When I finally arrived after what seemed endless 46 minutes, the place was completely dark. The lights of the reception I remembered seeing lit the day before, now they were off. However, this did not worry me in the least. The only thing I had in mind was to get out of that place. The first I pushed the front door with all my strength. I went through it and went straight to my car. As soon as I closed the door of the vehicle, I tore off and I stepped on the gas without wasting a second. The tires squealed on the gravel as I left the campsite behind and hit the road. The relief of having escaped began to wash over me, but my mind was still full of questions I couldn't find how to answer. I wish I could end this story with a surprising twist or some profound life lesson. But the truth is, this camping trip is still so mysterious today as it was the day I left that forest until now. I can't explain what happened if I didn't know better. I would say that somehow I entered another dimension or somewhere out of this world. However, if I told anyone that, I'm afraid I'd be considered insane and locked myself up somewhere. If I'm completely honest, this experience, however strange and terrifying it was, it left me with a feeling I hadn't experienced for a long time. I felt alive, more alive than I had felt in years. As I write these words, I have my backpack ready in front of me. Even though the campsite website has been taken down, I remember with absolute clarity as I get to the reception, I don't know what awaits me this time. But I'm sure of one thing. This time I'll listen with. I grew up in a small and picturesque town located in the heart of Mexico, a few hours' drive from Monterrey, Nuevo Leon. This charming place located next to a river that gave its name to the town was my childhood refuge for about 4 or 6 months a year. This Rinson was transformed into a true winter wonderland. And that was an integral part of my growing up. Winter sports, snowman building, and epic snowball battles with my childhood friend were very dear memories. Monterrey was my home, and I never imagined going far away from it. The furthest place I thought I would get to visit was the city to work. However, fate had other plans for my family, and these took us much further away from home than I ever could have imagined. My career took me all the way to Sydney, Australia, where I met a girl. We got married and decided to start our family. As my side of the family was more flexible with travel, we were visited in Sydney once or twice a year. But during all those years my children had only heard stories about their father's homeland, and most importantly, they had never seen snow. My Ang's daughter turned 5 and my little son Jamie was 4 when my wife and I decided it was time to show them the beauty of a Mexican winter. So we planned a trip back to Monterrey for Christmas in 2018. I was particularly excited, while Jamie seemed more bewildered by the idea as he landed in Monterrey and began the 100 kilometers journey to my parents' house. My children were left behind, completely captivated by the snow-covered landscape that enveloped us. Showing them my beloved town was a magical experience, and they thoroughly enjoyed their time with their grandparents. However, it was the snow that really stole the show, as my children were delighted with its splendor. In Australia, Christmas was celebrated in a similar way to Mexico, but the big difference was the weather. While the countries of the Northern Hemisphere were immersed in midwinter, the Southern Hemisphere was suffering from the sweltering heat of summer. It was a strange feeling seeing festive advertisements with fake snow at 40 GRC. Often I wondered if Australians would gladly trade their scorching weather for a frosty day, just to align more with the Christmas spirit for my kids. Having a snowy landscape at Christmas was as lovely as a trip to an amusement park, and they treasured every moment. No, they could have enough of the snow. They wanted to build snowmen, participate in snowball fights, and experience all the winter activities that I had enjoyed as a child. Putting on thick winter clothes was an exciting novelty for them. Age commented once he felt like he was an astronaut, given how strange the experience was for them. Our adventure took an unexpected turn when my wife saw an advertisement for a winter glamping experience in an LGE near the Sierra Madre Mountains. We excitedly booked an overnight stay in one of their large family yurts. We arrived on December 21st, ready to spend the day building an army of snowmen. By noon we had already spent hours playing in the snow, but when twilight began to fall, my wife decided to return to the yurt to prepare the dinner at the small camp stove. The children and I continued to play in the waning light, and after an intense snowball fight in which my children unexpectedly joined me, we all began to feel hungry. We were a short distance from the yurt, so I went ahead to see how dinner was going. My wife assured me that it would be ready soon. I returned to the place where the children were still playing, but when I arrived I only found Aim starting the base of another snowman. My heart skipped a beat when I realized that Jamie is not in sight. Initially I thought that Jamie could not have gone very far, but panic invaded me when Ange looked at me with concern and stuttered, "I don't know where he is." I could see the fear in his eyes, but what I felt at that moment was pure terror. I knew I had to find Jamie as soon as possible. I followed his little footprints in the snow, frantically calling to him. The moments that followed were the most terrifying of my life, intensified by the fact that Ain witnessed my desperate search, probably feeling responsible for her brother's disappearance. I followed Jamie's tracks until I was taken to a place that froze my blood. A frozen creek did not seem deep or wide, but it was the perfect size for a 4-year-old to fall into and be swept away by the current. My heart pounding as I scanned the water in BU for any sign of Jamie screaming his name in desperation, waiting for him to hear me and run back. Angie, terrified, watched from the shore as I ran back and forth, searching in vain, barely paying attention to the opposite shore, thinking it impossible that Jamie had crossed it without being swept away by the current. But then I heard his voice. I turned around, and to my amazement I saw him standing on the other side of the stream. Incredibly, he did not seem scared or worried. Jamie was walking carelessly through the snow with his coat and boots I ran across the stream, picked him up in my arms, and instead of scolding him, I was flooded with relief. I could see that he was too frightened as tears began to fill his eyes upon seeing Ong, who was also crying. I took him back to the yurt where my wife was waiting for us, confused and angry after telling her what had happened. His anger drifted between me, our daughter, and back to me. A much bigger tragedy. Once we calmed down a bit, had dinner, and put the kids to bed, yet I couldn't stop thinking about something that had been running through my head since we found Jamie after dinner. I couldn't help but ask him, "Hey champ, how did you cross that roll?" We were all so relieved to have found Jamie, safe and sound. That was the main concern in my mind. I couldn't help but I had stopped to think about how I had gotten to the other side until that moment. Jamie's answer left me cold. With a calm and carefree voice, he told me, "The snowman took me." When he heard that, my blood went cold. I knew that a snowman could not have carried him through a frozen stream, but someone or something had done it, and that idea produced a feeling of discomfort in me. On my stomach, as gently as possible, I explained to Jamie that it couldn't have been a snowman, and asked him if maybe it had been a person dressed in white or someone who had snow on his clothes or hair. He shook his head and firmly repeated, "The snowman took me." Before I could ask any more questions, closed his eyes, and fell fast asleep in less than 10 minutes. That night I couldn't sleep well, with questions rolling in my head. I couldn't imagine what Jamie had experienced, or why he didn't react more strongly to being taken away by a stranger the next morning. We were ready to return home and didn't even consider asking for a refund for the stay. We were too shocked by what happened. When I returned to Monterey, I decided to contact the police to report what had happened. In less than a day, confirmed our worst fears. On the opposite bank of the creek, next to Jamie's small footprints, they found much larger footprints that undoubtedly belonged to whoever might have tried to take him away. Jamie then told us that the person who had carried him was wearing a white hat or Clara clothes, and that he had carried him for a brief moment through the forest before leaving him on the ground and walking away. Jamie didn't remember exchanging words or feeling scared during the encounter, which was strange for a child who would normally react to being picked up by a complete stranger. There was something deeply disturbing about the whole incident. The memory of that day continues to haunt you, to avoid wondering what would have happened if that person hadn't decided to release him. San Juan del Rio was a small town in the heart of Mexico, hidden among mountains and enveloped in a silence that was only broken by the singing of birds and the murmur of the wind among the trees. The town, although picturesque and full of traditions, hid a dark story that few dared to tell. Is the story of what he gave on a cold winter night when the darkness that lurked in the shadows finally decided to claim what he considered his own. Juan del Rio was always a quiet place where life went slowly and without great shocks. The inhabitants all knew each other, and the doors of the houses were always open, showing the hospitality that characterized its people. However, there was a place in the town that everyone avoided: the Antigua Hacienda de los Martí, a vast property that stood on the outskirts in the deepest part of the bosque. The hacienda had belonged to the Martinez family for generations, but since the mysterious disappearance of all its members decades ago, the place had been abandoned, falling into a state of ruin and decay. The inhabitants of the town told stories about the hacienda, stories that were passed down from mouth to mouth, and who warned the younger ones not to approach that place, said that something dark dwelt within its walls, something that had led to the perdition of all those who had ever lived there. One afternoon, in the middle of a particularly cold winter, two strangers arrived in the town. A man and a woman, both young and with an air of the city that made them stand out among the locals, introduced themselves as Arturo and Sofia, a newlywed couple looking for a quiet place to start their life together. No one in the village knew how, but somehow Arturo and Sofia got the keys to the Hacienda Martinez. The news that someone was moving into the hacienda caused a stir in San Juan del Rio. The elders of the town tried to warn the couple by telling them about the legends surrounding the house, but Arturo and Sofia were not intimidated. Both were skeptics, accustomed to modern life and rational explanations. For them it was nothing more than a beautiful property in poor condition, ready to be restored and turned into their home. At first everything seemed to be going well. Arturo and Sofia began to work on the restoration of the house, cleaning the dust accumulated over the years and repairing the most serious damage. Despite the dilapidated state of the hacienda, both were excited by the challenge of returning it to its former glory, but as the days went by they began to notice strange things. The first indication was the cold. Although it was the middle of winter, the cold inside the house was different, more penetrating, as if emanating from the same walls. The chimneys never managed to heat the rooms completely, and sometimes during the night creaks and bangs were heard that resounded throughout the house as if someone were walking through the empty corridors. Arturo tried to find logical explanations for these phenomena, attributing them to the wear of the wood and the wind that blew between the cracks in the walls. However, Sophia could not help but feel a growing discomfort, a feeling of being constantly watched, as if the invisible eyes of the house followed her wherever she went. One night while the couple rested after a long day of work, something happened that would change everything. Sophia woke up startled in the middle of the night. All around her the darkness was total, but she felt that she was not alone. With her heart beating quickly, she tried to wake Arturo, but he seemed to be in a deep sleep, as if something had dragged him into an abyss from which he could not escape. Suddenly a shadow slipped down the wall in front of her. A shadow that didn't belong to any object in the room was tall, thin and elongated, with a human shape, but distorted as if plowed from a stretched and twisted figure. The shadow didn't move like a normal shadow. It seemed to have a life of its own, moving along the wall with a dark purpose. Sophia froze, unable to move or scream as the shadow slowly slid towards the ceiling, disappearing in the darkness. When she finally managed to move, she shook Arturo, waking her up, assuring her that it had only been a bad dream. But Sophia knew that what she had seen was real. The next day, Sophia could not stop thinking about what she had seen. Determined to find out what was happening, she began to investigate the history of the hacienda. She visited the elders of the town, who told her how little they knew about the Martinez family and their mysterious disappearance. According to the stories, the family had been one of the most powerful and respected in the region. But from one day to the next, all its members disappeared without a trace. Some said that the Martinez had been cursed by something they dug up on their lands, while others claimed that the family had made a pact with dark forces, a pact that had finally taken its price. What everyone agreed was that since then no one had lived on the hacienda without suffering terrible consequences. Sophia also found old documents in the house, diaries and letters that revealed disturbing details about the last days of the Martinez. The writing spoke of visions of shadows, of voices whispering in the darkness, and of a growing sense of despair that enveloped all who lived in the hacienda. One of the diaries ended abruptly with a sentence that made Sophia feel a chill running down her spine. "Darkness is coming for us. There is no escape." As the days went by, the strange events in the hacienda intensified. Arturo began to experience strange nightmares in which he saw himself trapped in a dark labyrinth from which he could not escape. In his dreams there was always a figure in the distance, a shadow that observed him without approaching, but whose simple act of looking at him filled him with indescribable terror. For her part, Sophia began to see the shadows. Even during the day she could feel their presence around her, hearing whispers that seemed to come from the walls, unintelligible words but loaded with palpable evil. On several occasions she felt a cold hand touching her shoulder when she was alone, but when she turned there was no one there. One night Arturo woke up to find Sophia standing in front of the window staring into the forest. When he tried to talk to her, he didn't answer. His eyes were empty, as if she were in a deep trance. Arthur tried to shake her, but it was as if an invisible force was holding her anchored in place. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Sophia reacted, but she didn't remember anything that had happened. Desperate to find a solution, Sophia went back to seek help from the elders of the village. One of the Don Isidro, an older man who had always lived in San Juan del Rio, told him about an ancient ritual that could help calm the spirits that inhabited the hacienda. The ritual, known as the Ritual of L'Ocaso, had to be performed at sunset, when the shadows were longer and the barrier between the world of the living and the dead was at its weakest point. Don Isidro warned Sophia that the ritual was dangerous and that it had to be performed with extreme care, because if something went wrong the consequences could be catastrophic. However, Sophia was determined to do whatever was necessary to free the hacienda from the darkness that harassed it. That same night at sunset, Sophia and Arturo prepared to perform the ritual. They lit candles in each corner of the main room, and Sophia began to, as he recited the words that Don Isidro had taught him. As he pronounced the words, the air in the room became dense, and the shadows on the walls began to move, twisting as if they had a life of their own. At a crucial moment of the ritual, one of the candles suddenly went out, plunging the room into partial darkness. The shadows began to slide towards the center of the room, forming a dark and amorphous that seemed to grow with each passing second. Arthur tried to restart the candle, but his hands trembled so much that the match fell to the ground. The dark figure approached Sophia and she felt an overwhelming pressure in her chest, as if the darkness itself was trying to enter her with the last strength she had left. Sophia shouted the final words of the ritual, and at that moment an explosion of light filled the room. Pushing the shadows back to the walls as the light faded, Sophia fell to the floor, exhausted but alive. Arthur ran to her, hugging her tightly as the shadows slowly faded into the gloom. The ritual had worked, at least for the time being. But they both knew that the darkness had not been completely defeated. She had only withdrawn. Waiting for the right moment to return the next morning without wasting time, Sophia and Arturo decided to leave the hacienda and San Juan del Rio forever. They packed only the essentials and left the house that had witnessed so much suffering. The inhabitants of the town watched them leave in silence, knowing that the darkness in the hacienda was something that no one should have dealt with. As they walked away along the dirt road, Sophia looked one last time towards the hacienda. She could see the empty windows dark as the eyes of a skull, and although the house seemed quiet in the daylight, he knew that darkness was still there, lurking, waiting patiently. The years passed and San Juan del Rio continued with his quiet life, although the Hacienda Martinez remained uninhabited, preventing darkness from spreading beyond its walls. The story of Sophia and Arthur became another legend of the town, told in its aurochs around the campfires, a warning to those who dared to defy the unknown. No one lived in the hacienda again, and over time nature began to claim it, covering its walls with vines and letting the forest slowly engulf it. But even today, if someone passes near the ancient property at nightfall, you can feel a chill running down your spine, as if something in the dark is watching, waiting for someone else to cross its threshold to claim what you consider yours. In a small town in northern Mexico, surrounded by mountains covered with thick forests, there is a road known as Route 34. This stretch, seemingly harmless during the day, it took on a sinister air at night. Sharp curves, absence, total lighting, and a series of stories that were told in whispers made many drivers avoid traveling through it after dark. Despite the warnings, Raul, a 48-year-old experienced driver, accepted the one to cover the night shift on Route 34. He was a skeptical man raised among tales of apparitions and specters that haunted the forest, but he never believed in those fantasies, as he himself called them. However, the memory of his younger brother Julian, who disappeared more than 20 years ago on a nearby trail, haunted him since then. Raul lived with a mixture of guilt and desire to find answers for what he had with his family, encouraging him to try new challenges, and his curiosity pushing him to face his fears. Raul decided to accept the route. He wanted to see for himself if legends were more than stories to scare novices on their first night. Raul felt a concern that he couldn't explain before leaving. Some colleagues gave him worried looks and others just patted him on the shoulder wishing him luck. One of them, Mateo, whispered to him while giving him the keys to the bus. "Be careful, Raul. Route 34 doesn't forgive anyone. Stop things, Mateo. Stories are just that, children's stories," Raul replied with a forced smile, trying to hide his nervousness. The bus he was assigned was an old model with worn leather and windows that creaked when opened. Raul checked the instruments, adjusted the mirrors, and started the engine, whose familiar roar restored some calm. Only a handful of passengers got on at the first stop: an old man with his wife, a young mother with her young son, and a nervous-looking man who sat in the back. The window, as the bus moved along the winding road, the feeling of isolation intensified. The lights of the town faded, leaving only the gloom of the headlights and the silhouettes of trees that seemed to close over the road. The silence was broken only by the sound of the engine and the slight murmur of the passengers. It was then that small details began to disturb Raul. An icy breeze ran through the interior of the bus, causing the passengers to close the lights to flicker, projecting dancing shadows on the walls. Raul looked in the rearview mirror and noticed that the nervous man in the background now, he had an expression of absolute terror. "All right back there?" Raul asked, trying to sound nonchalant. The man replied in a tremulous voice, "I think I saw something outside following the bus." Raul tried to concentrate on the road, but couldn't ignore the growing tension. The sensation of being watched became almost unbearable, as if invisible eyes were fixed on him. The murmurs began to become audible, soft and distant at first, but gaining strength with each kilometer traveled. It was then that the little boy, who until that moment had been calm, began to cry inconsolably. His crying was high-pitched, almost unnatural, and the mother tried to calm him down without success. Suddenly the child stopped crying and pointed with his little finger to the window with eyes full of terror. He said, "He's here." Raul felt the air on the bus getting colder, decided to speed up, but the vehicle began to respond slowly, as if something was holding him outside. Long shadows seemed to slide through the trees, moving at the same pace as the bus. Raoul tried to stay calm as he stepped on the accelerator, but the bus didn't seem to want to obey. It was as if an invisible force was holding him back on Route 34. The passengers were restless. Some were murmuring prayers, while others were desperately looking out of the windows, waiting to see the lights of some nearby town. The mother hugged her son tightly, but the little boy remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the window, as if something was there watching him. The old man sitting next to his wife murmured something that Raoul barely managed to hear through the engine noise. Is like in stories, no one is saved if they choose you, they asked R.A. Turning his head towards the rearview mirror, the old man looked up, his eyes full of a mixture of fear and resignation. The shadows of the forest, those souls who never found rest, say they are looking for company or revenge. A shiver ran down Raoul's spine, but he forced himself to focus on the road. The shadows that before they seemed to move through the trees, now they glided closer, as if they surrounded the bus. Suddenly a loud bang on the roof made all the passengers scream in unison. Raoul squeezed the steering wheel, his heart pounding. Calm, it must have been a branch, he said, trying to calm himself down more than the others, but as he spoke, a second bang louder than the previous one echoed off the roof, followed by a metallic sound that seemed to come from the roof of the bus. Raoul turned on the interior lights and turned briefly towards the passengers. Their faces were pale, full of terror. At that moment he noticed that the man who was previously sitting in the back was no longer there. His seat was empty, but the window next to him was open, letting in an icy breeze. "Where is the man who was here?" he asked, although and answered only the old man with a broken voice. He muttered, "They took him away." Raoul didn't want to hear any more. He accelerated the bus hard, and this time the engine roared as if responding to the driver's panic. The road began to twist strangely, as if the curves were tighter than he remembered. Each turn seemed to take them deeper into the darkness of the forest. Then something appeared in the middle of the road. A tall, motionless figure wrapped in Raoul slammed on the brakes with all his might, and the bus skidded with a shrill screeching. The passengers screamed, and the vehicle stopped a few meters from the figure. Raoul was breathing heavily as he tried to focus his eyes on the road. The figure remained there, motionless, but as the lights of the bus illuminated it, it began to take shape. It was a man, or at least it seemed so, blurred as if dissolving into the gloom. But what made Raoul feel a knot in his stomach was something familiar. In that presence, Julian whispered, his voice trembling. The figure took a step forward, and then the face of his missing brother emerged clearly from the shadow. His eyes were lifeless, and his skin seemed torn by something other than time. "Why did you take me away?" Raoul asked the figure, his voice resounding like a deep and painful echo. Raoul couldn't move. His mind was flooded with memories of his childhood, of the times he took care of Julian when they were little, and above all of the day he disappeared. "No, I didn't leave you. I looked for you. I didn't know what had happened," he tried to explain. But the words barely came out of his mouth. Julian's figure raised a hand, and a gust of air ice cream invaded the bus. The lights began to flicker, and the passengers screamed. Some were crying inconsolably. The mother clung to her son, who was pointing again to the window, repeating in a monotone voice, "He is here, he is here." Suddenly Julian's figure vanished, dissolving into a dense black fog that began to surround the bus outside. The shadows kept moving, faster, closer. Raoul knew that if he didn't do something soon, everyone would end up like their brother, trapped in that limbo between life and death. "We have to get out of here," Raoul shouted, taking the wheel with trembling hands. The bus moved slowly, as if fighting against a force that held him back. But at the end of the road Raoul saw a faint light. "It is the town. We are almost there." However, before he could get any closer, the engine of the bus suddenly died. The lights were turned off, and the darkness completely enveloped them. The bus was completely silent, trapped in a darkness that seemed to breathe around him. Raoul turned the engine key, but only got a dry snap in response. The passengers began to murmur to each other, the palpable fear in their voices, the old man now clinging to his wife's hand said, "There is no escape anymore. What is out there loves us." To everyone, Raoul tried to ignore those words, got out of his seat, took an emergency flashlight from the dashboard, and headed to the aisle, looking at the calm passengers. "I'm going to get out and check the engine. Just stay inside the bus, and it won't open the doors for anyone." Understood. Silence was his only response. The boy pointed to the window again. But this time he didn't say anything. His expression was one of pure terror. Raoul swallowed, salivating and plucking up courage. He opened the door of the bus. An icy wind greeted him, cutting his skin like invisible blades, with a flashlight trembling in his hand. He went down the steps and into the road. Outside, the fog was thicker than it seemed from inside. He could barely see a couple of meters in front of him. The flashlight illuminated the road, but the shadows seemed to move at the edge of its light like if he were being stalked. Raoul leaned over the front of the bus and lifted the hood. His knowledge of mechanics was not vast, but something caught his attention immediately. The wires were completely torn, as if something had torn them off with inhuman force. A noise behind him. He spun it suddenly. The Lin lit the way, but there was nothing there. The silence was so dense that he could hear his own breath ragged. Suddenly he heard soft but unmistakable footsteps, as if something was slowly walking towards him from the fog. Raoul raised the flashlight to the sound, but all he found was empty. However, a familiar voice emerged from the cold and pain-laden gloom. "Why did you abandon me?" Raoul was Julian. Raoul felt his legs falter. His brother's figure began to materialize in the fog, first like a blurred shadow, then with more detail. But something was terribly wrong. His eyes were empty, dark hollows that seemed to devour all the light. "Julian, I didn't abandon you. I looked for you for weeks. I never stopped." Raoul screamed with tears filling his eyes. "It wasn't enough," Julian replied, his voice echoing with an echo that seemed to come from all directions. The figure took a step forward, and Raoul stepped back until he collided with the side of the bus. He felt an intense cold in his chest, as if something was squeezing his heart. The fog around July began to stir, and more figures emerged from it, deformed shadows that seemed to scream in silence. Raoul raised the flashlight in a desperate attempt to scare that away. But the light barely pushed back the shadows. Then a bang resounded from inside the bus, a sound so loud that it echoed in the forest. Raoul turned his head toward the door and saw the passengers pressed against the windows, banging on them frantically. The screams inside the bus were deafening. He ran back to the door and jumped up. As he entered, he saw what was causing the chaos. The shadows had crept inside. They seemed to snake between the seats, surrounding the passengers. The woman was trying to protect her son, while the old man and his wife were praying desperately. Raoul felt an urge to struggle, grabbed a cross hanging from the rearview mirror and lifted it up with a trembling hand. "Leave them alone," he cried out with a firmness he didn't know he had. The shadows paused for a moment, but a hollow laugh filled the air. Julian appeared again, this time inside the bus. "He can't save them, Raoul. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who they remained here." Raoul looked at the boy, who seemed to be in a trance, his eyes fixed on Julian's figure. "They want you to finish what he started," said the boy in a voice that didn't look like his own. "What does that mean?" Raoul asked in desperation. The boy raised his hand, pointing to something beyond the bus. In the distance between the trees there was a dilapidated house that he knew immediately. It was the place where Julian, his heart, had disappeared. It stopped for a moment. "That's where it all began, and that's where it must end," Julian said before disappearing in a swirl of fog. Raoul knew he had no choice. He looked at the passengers, who were now looking at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "I'm going to go to that house. If something happens, drive this bus as far as you can." The old man looked at him sternly. "You won't be alone. We'll accompany you." "No, this is something I must do," said Raoul, although deep down he knew he didn't have the strength to face it. Alone, Raoul got off the bus with hesitant steps, the flashlight in one hand and the cross in the other. The murmurs of the passengers followed him until the doors closed behind him, leaving an oppressive silence that was broken only by the creaking of his boots on the asphalt. The house, in ruin, rose in the distance, shrouded in mist. Its structure looked more like a wooden corpse than a building. The walls were slanted, and the broken windows looked like empty eyes that watched with malevolence. Every step he took towards that place seemed heavier, as if the air itself was trying to stop him. When he arrived, he stopped in front of the main door that hung from a rusty hinge. The cross he carried began to vibrating slightly in his hand, as if reacting to an invisible presence. He swallowed hard, pushed the door and entered. The interior was plunged into darkness, with only the light of the lantern illuminating fragments of the place. The main room was full of dust, and the remains of broken furniture were piled up in the corners. But what caught his attention the most was a symbol carved on the floor. A circle surrounded by inscriptions that Raoul I couldn't understand. In the center, a small improvised altar with melted candles and strange objects seemed to have been the scene of some ritual. An icy breeze swept through the room, and with it a whisper. "Raoul, you were destined to come here." Raoul turned in all directions looking for the origin of the voice. There was no one, but the feeling of being surrounded was unmistakable. Suddenly a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Julian. Oh, Al minus what was left of him. His form was more solid than before, but his empty eyes and his resonant voice left. Of course, he was not fully human. "You can free us, brother, but you will have to face him." "Who?" asked Raoul, his voice trembling. "To who started it all. The one who condemned us." Before Raoul could process those words, the air in the room changed. An unbearable pressure made him fall to his knees in front of the altar. A figure materialized. It was a tall man with a torn black robe and eyes that shone like embers. His face was a mask of fury and evil. "You dare to enter my domain?" the figure roared, his voice shaking the walls of the house. Raoul tried to get up, but an invisible force kept him on the ground. The cross he was carrying began to warm in his hand, and with a superhuman effort he managed to raise it in front of him. "I will not leave until you free Julian and all those you have trapped here." The figure shouted, a chilling laugh. "They belong to me. Their souls are my food, and you will be no different from the shadows around the altar." Other forms began to emerge, specters that seemed trapped in eternal suffering. Some were crying, others were screaming silently. Among them Raoul recognized Julian, who now seemed to be struggling to get closer to him. At that moment Raoul remembered something his mother used to tell him when he was a child. "Faith can move mountains, but love can destroy any darkness." With that phrase in mind, he clung to the cross and began to recite a prayer that his mother taught him. His voice trembled at first, but with each word he felt more strength. The dark figure roared with fury. "Enough, you can't defeat me," he shouted as he advanced towards Raoul with his hands outstretched like claws. But Raoul did not stop. He kept praying, his voice now firm and full of determination. The cross began to emit a bright light that filled the room, forcing the shadows to retreat. The specters, including Julian, began to disappear, their faces showing a relief that Raoul would never forget. The dark figure uttered one last cry before fading into an explosion of fog. The pressure in the room disappeared, and the altar crumbled into a pile of rubble. Raoul stood in the center of the circle, breathing heavily, but knowing that he had accomplished something important. Before leaving, a soft voice resounded behind him. "Thank you, brother." It was Julian, who now had a calm countenance. His figure slowly faded, leaving Raoul with tears in his eyes. As Raoul left the house, on the bus was miraculously turned on and waiting for him on the road. The passengers, although visibly scared, looked at him with hope, climbed into the vehicle, sat in front of the steering wheel, and with one last look at the dilapidated house, he started the bus. As city lights began to appear in the distance, Raoul knew that something had changed forever. The shadows would not haunt that road again. But he would always carry the memories that night had come in the small town of San Andres, a place known for its quiet streets and colonial houses, but also for an old sewer system that snaked beneath the ground like a sleeping monster. Julio, an ordinary man, had just finished a long day at work and was getting ready to go to bed. Before he did, decided to make a quick visit to the bathroom. An act, or at least that's what he thought. The silence in the house was absolute. The wind blew softly outside, making the windows creak, but Julio barely noticed it. He sat on the porcelain toilet looking for a moment of peace. However, something disturbing began to infiltrate his mind. Have you ever felt that you are being watched in the most intimate moments? That irrational thought crossed Julio's head while he was staring absent-mindedly at the floor. But then something happened. A strange noise, a faint splash that shouldn't be there, broke the silence. Julio frowned and looked at the toilet bowl. "I must be imagining things," he thought, trying to convince himself that there was nothing out of the ordinary. But the sound persisted, now clearer. It came from the depths of the toilet. Taking in air, he decided to lift the lid cautiously, not knowing that the act would change his life forever. What he saw left him paralyzed. Small dark eyes watched him from the water, shining with an unnatural field. He was a mouse, but not just any mouse. This one was bigger than usual, soaked and with his body dirty from the sewer water. His yellow teeth seemed to shine in the gloom of the bathroom. Julio tried to scream, but panic closed his throat. The mouse, away from being scared, he jumped out of the toilet with a high-pitched squeal, lunging towards him. Julio backed away sharply, stumbling and falling to the floor. The soaked rodent ran across the floor before disappearing into the darkness of the hallway, his heart beating uncontrollably. Julio stayed on the bathroom floor, mind unable to process what had just happened. The images of the aggressive mouse, the splashing of the water, everything was repeated in his head. One and one again, it was as if his own home had been invaded by something beyond his comprehension. The sense of security he had always felt at home vanished the next day, still in a state of SOC. He decided to write a letter to the village health authorities. He described the incident in detail, still unable to believe what had happened. I had never felt so vulnerable in my own home, he confessed in the letter. Shortly afterwards, the local media echoed his history, contacted Mr. Domingo Perez, a pest control specialist who had worked in the region for more than 20 years. It is a life-changing experience, Domingo said when asked about sewer mice. These incidents are more common than people believe and always take you by surprise. The expert explained that in the last 10 years, more than 400 cases had been reported of mice emerging from toilets in the region in San Andres alone. He and his team had dealt with between 58 cases a year. Mice have learned to navigate the sewer system in search of food, he said, adding that they are often attracted to food scraps that people throw down the kitchen drain when they can't access the kitchen. He shared some tips to avoid these types of unpleasant encounters. I always recommend people to close the toilet lid, and if they hear strange noises, don't panic, he said. According to him, the best thing to do in these cases is to give several shocks. The mouse usually gets tired and goes back the way it came or drowns, he explained. However, the solution is not always so simple. Some mice are surprisingly persistent. He commented on one occasion, we had to give more than 5 shocks to evict one who did not want to leave. They are small but tenacious. Although Julio had managed to overcome the incident, the feeling of vulnerability never completely left him. His bathroom before, a place of tranquility and privacy, had become a constant source of anxiety, and although Domingo and his team had managed to control the situation, Julio always wondered if one day it would happen again because, after all, in San Andres, as in many other places in the world, the sewer system is not just a network of pipes, it is a dark and dangerous kingdom inhabited by creatures that emerge when you least expect it, challenging the safety of your home and turning the most mundane routine into a nightmare from which it is not so easy to wake up. In a small town in northern Mexico surrounded by mountains and dense foliage lived a close-knit family. The Ramirez were known for their hospitality and the warmth with which they welcomed any visitor. Their home, an old hacienda with thick walls and high ceilings, had belonged to the family for generations. However, as in any story involving ancient places, there was a secret that few dared to mention. It all began one cold winter when Clara, the youngest daughter, Clara had always been a lively girl, with a smile that lit up any room. But in a matter of days, that light up that seemed to go out, she stopped playing with her dolls. Her laughter faded and she began to spend long hours locked in her room muttering things that no one understood. Her mother Maria noticed that something was wrong when she found Clara sitting on the floor of her room surrounded by her toys, all of them lined up in a way that seemed to follow a pattern that only she knew. Clara was whispering words in a language that Maria could not recognize. "Who you speak with?" my love asked softly. But Clara only looked at her with eyes that did not seem her own and answered with them. That answer made a shiver run down Maria's spine. She decided to talk to her husband Javier, who at first thought it was just children's things. But the next day something happened that they could not ignore. It was dark when Maria and Javier heard a heartbreaking scream coming from Clara's room. They ran desperately, and when they opened the door they found her standing in the middle of the room trembling and with her eyes wide open. "They come for me," Clara screamed, pointing to a dark corner of Javier's. She turned on the light, but no, there was nothing there. However, the atmosphere was charged with a palpable tension, as if something or someone was present watching them from the darkness. Clara collapsed on the ground, unconscious. They decided to take her to the village doctor, who after checking her assured them that there was nothing physically wrong with her. "Maybe it's stress," the doctor suggested, but Maria wasn't convinced. She knew that something dark was looming over her desperate daughter. Maria came to the local church. Father Miguel, an older man known for his wisdom and kindness, listened attentively to Mary's story. "This is not something that medicine can explain," he said gravely. "There are forces in this world that we do not understand, but that are real." Father Miguel decided to visit Clara. When he entered the hacienda, he felt a strange tightness in his chest, a sensation that intensified as he approached the room of the girl. When she entered, Clara was in bed with her eyes closed, but her body was moving in a spasmodic way. Suddenly she opened her eyes, and with a voice that was not her own, she said, "You can't stop us, Father." The priest, shocked but determined, began to pray. As he did so, Clara began to scream and squirm as if something inside her. She wanted to escape. "We possess her. She belongs to us," she screamed with a cultural voice that echoed on the walls of the room. Father Miguel knew that what he was facing was not a simple hallucination. It was something much more sinister. "Almighty God, protect her," he cried out while sprinkling holy water on Clara. At that moment, the girl threw a shot that did not look human, and the window of the room exploded into 1,000 pieces. After what seemed like an eternity, Clara was silent. Father Miguel, exhausted, she left the room and talked to her parents. "It's not an ordinary demon what possesses her," she told them. "It's an ancient spirit, one that has been on this earth long before us. We must prepare. This is not over." That night Clara was left alone. But the atmosphere in the hacienda was unsettling. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the wind that blew through the corridors carried with it a whisper strange, as if someone spoke in a barely audible voice. The following days were hell for the Ramirez family. Clara was still a pawn in the hands of that entity. They often found her talking with an invisible presence, her eyes empty and her skin pale as wax. Things in the house began to move by themselves, and a smell of sulfur permeated the air. Javier decided that they could not continue like this. He contacted to an exorcist, a man who had been recommended by Father Michael. The exorcist arrived a week later, a middle-aged man with a grave, tired expression, as if he had seen things he did not wish to remember. The exorcist, named Matthew, went straight to the point. "What resides in his daughter is not something to be taken lightly. This spirit has not only possessed Clara, but has made from this house. We must expel him from both." That night the ritual began. Matthew, accompanied by Father Miguel and Clara's parents, entered the room. Clara was tied to the bed, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, because her superhuman strength had made it clear that it was not safe to let her go free. The exorcism began with prayers, but soon Clara's voice was raised, resounding throughout the hacienda. "They cannot get me out of here," he said in a deep voice. "I've been here long before they arrived, and I'll still be here after they leave." The walls of the room began to vibrate, and the temperature dropped drastically. Matthew continued with the prayers, his voice firm, although her face showed signs of tension. Clara began to levitate on the bed, and the bonds that held her tightened until they almost broke. "In the name of God, I order you to leave this body," Matthew exclaimed, as he sprinkled holy water on the girl. Clara shouted a sound so sharp and piercing that everyone present had to cover their ears. Suddenly Clara fell on the bed motionless. The atmosphere seemed to relax for a moment, but Mateo did not let his guard down. He knew that this was only an attempt by the spirit to deceive them, and he was right. A moment later Clara opened her eyes, and they were pitch black as bottomless pits. "I'll never leave her," she said in a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. Matthew continued with the exorcism, calling on God's name over and over again. Suddenly a hurricane wind rose inside the room, threw objects everywhere. Candlelight flickered, and then went out, leaving the room in complete darkness. Clara's screams turned in laughter, a laugh that was both childish and terrifying. "She is ours," she repeated. But Matthew did not hold the cross high. He continued to pray, ignoring the threats and mockery of the spirit. Finally, in a heartbreaking cry, Clara collapsed on the bed once again. This time something dark and dense seemed to come out of her mouth, a shadow that twisted in the air before disappearing into the darkness of the night. Mateo fell to his knees, exhausted. "It's done," he said between gasps. "But this house is still marked. They must leave. It is not safe to stay here." The Ramirez did not hesitate. They left the hacienda the next day, abandoning everything they could not take with them. They moved to the city, trying to leave behind the horrors of that night. Clara, although apparently free of the spirit, the vivacity was never the same again. That once characterized her had disappeared forever, leaving in its place a deep melancholy. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were loaded of a knowledge that no child should possess. In time, the hacienda was abandoned. It was said that those who came too close could hear whispers in the wind, voices coming from the shadows calling anyone who was willing to listen. And although the Ramirez managed to escape with their lives, they knew that the darkness that had touched their daughter could not be forgotten so easily. They had defied an ancient force, and although they had survived, The cost had been high because in the darkest corners of her Clara could still hear those whispers reminding her that although the house had been left behind, something deeper, darker would always be with her. At the end of 2004, the residents of T in Ipswich woke up to find a moving van parked in their street. The 7 sign in front of an empty house had recently been removed, and supervising the unloading of boxes and furniture was a happy young couple who had moved to Ipswich from the much smaller seaside town of Felice Tube. For their neighbors they represented happiness, harmony, and hope for the future. However, what no one knew except one was that the arrival of the couple foreshadowed a great and terrible darkness on the night of December 2, 2006. Little more than 2 years after the young couple moved to RCAS, a member of the local police was patrolling the banks of a nearby river when he made a terrifying discovery. The naked body of a young woman was floating in the waters of the Brock. Within an hour, the scene was filled with uniformed officers, plainclothes detectives, and forensic teams in white coats. The woman was 25-year-old Jetir, who had been spotted last near Eos in Ipswich about 2 weeks ago. Police discovered that Gemma had been addicted to heroin during her teenage years and was working as a prostitute at the time of her murder. Just 6 days later, on December 8th, the body of 19-year-old F. Hills was found floating in a nearby body of water. Tanya had managed to graduate from high school, but by the age of 17 she was living in emergency accommodations while prostituting herself to sustain a growing drug addiction. Police interviewed those who knew her and found that she was close friends with the first victim. Red Fear detectives had not yet begun the proper investigation into Tanya's death when a third body was found in a wooded area near Naon. Anelli, 24, was 3 months pregnant when she was suffocated before that her body was arranged in a cruciform position. The last time she was seen was on the 6:43 p.m. train to Ipswich, but after getting off at the station she disappeared. The police discovered that Annalie had attended high school in Seston, where her academic performance was exemplary. However, after her father's death from lung cancer in 1998, Annalie became increasingly dependent heroin to deal with in the duel following the discovery of 3 bodies in Quick succession. Safek police held a press conference for a group of local journalists after the results of a preliminary investigation. The police chief alerted all Safek women to stay away from poorly lit areas in Ipswich after dark. The following day, the bodies of 2 other young women were found near Levington. According to police, B, 24, and Kos, 20, had been killed by throat compression, was last seen on the night of December 10th, and just days earlier had participated in a person-on-the-street style interview with a local news station about the recent killings. Clennell, a prostitute, told the reporter she was a little worried about getting into the police discovered that she had moved to Ipswich about 10 years ago and had lost custody of her 3 children due to a devastating heroin addiction. Annette Nichols, the eldest of the 5 victims, had been addicted to drugs for around 6 years. Mother of 1, had worked as a beautician before her addiction, but gave up custody of her son too. Engaging in organized prostitution was also the only other victim who was disposed of in a cruciform position, such as the image of Christ on the cross. Given the victims' history, the places where they were abandoned, and the ways in which Nichols and Alderton were disposed of, Safek police concluded that the murders were related. They launched a full-scale investigation called Operation Sumac, with the police chief stating that the assistance it would be crucial to their success. The killer was believed to be a burly man in his 30s and 40s, who almost certainly lived among them. He was someone's husband, someone's father, or someone's son. The police would do everything they could to bring the man to justice, but he was not in the best position to spot the signs. They alerted the citizens of Ipswich to be vigilant. Anyone who had thoroughly cleaned their car recently or anyone who disappeared overnight for long periods without explanation. The prospect left a dark cloud over Ipswich and its citizens, who wondered who would be next. On December 14th, police held another press conference where they announced that the investigation was progressing steadily. They discovered that every woman had been killed at a main location before being transported to a body of water or to a wooded area near a school. They also announced that they believed their suspect was a violent, possibly religious man who frequented women of the night. They subsequently warned the public to be on the lookout for any man who had suddenly acquired women's clothing, as the killer was believed to be taking trophies from his unfortunate victims the next day. The police announced that the number of officers working on the case full-time had increased to 600, and that the staff of more than 25 British police forces were lending material or human resources to the investigation just 5 days later. On December 19, 2006, the Suffolk police carried out an operation in the early morning on a quiet suburban street south of the Orwell River. The name of the street was Ted K, and the man arrested was a 48-year-old man named Jew Froey, the same one who had moved into the empty house with his partner more than 2 years earlier. The move had been an optimistic act, with Pate and his wife taking the opportunity to start a new life together after the failure of the first marriage. However, it somehow ended with the brutal murders of 5 young people, leaving both the beings loved as law enforcement wondering why this veg was born in Norfolk in April 1958 and was the second son of an RAF policeman and a nurse due to his father's career. The family moved around a lot during Eid's childhood and spent his youth in Malta, Singapore, and Suffolk before G turned 10 years old. His parents went through a divorce bitterly. On the other hand, E's mother claimed that her father was a violent alcoholic and that she left out of fear for her life, also stating that fear for W was the only reason she had not taken him with her, since her father had taken him with her, sworn to seek them out and kill them and try to take their son as a result of his turbulent upbringing. K grew up as a painfully shy young man struggling with relationships and jobs, dropped out of school at 16 with no qualifications, and after a brief stint as a hotel gardener joined the British Merchant Navy, worked as a chef on ocean liners departing from Feliz Tobe. But after less than a year of service he filed for separation. Went from job to job working as a steward, waiter, tenant and forklift operator, but soon returned to sailing and applied for a position as a steward on the cruise ship Ken Elizabeth Esteb. Spent 6 years aboard the K2 and traveled around the world in the process. At each port they stopped at Ed, had a few days of shore leave, but unlike his shipmates who spent their time shopping or sightseeing, used to visit local brothels became something of an addiction for him, and his colleagues knew he would disappear for days before returning to the ship, seeming quiet and distant at the end of his 6 years, in which 2 moved to Norwich and became the tenant of a pub known as the Bed. Was located in an extremely harsh area of Norway and was frequented by many of the women of the night of the city. It was believed that he was a regular customer of theirs, and that may or may not have contributed to his eventual dismissal just 5 months after being hired. He then moved to London, where he was visited by his mother during the 1992 holidays. Patricia Ed later told reporters that despite an initial warm reception, his son changed completely on Christmas Day by drinking continuously from morning to night, and when his mother suggested that he slow down a little he got angry and kicked her out of his house. It was this and that, she told reporters. She said terrible things. Obviously she didn't want anything to do with me. It was around that time that she started frequenting massage parlors in London. But that was an expensive habit that he didn't fit the minimum wage jobs he used to have, as he began to gamble to fund his nighttime company, but soon accumulated mounting debt, seeing no other way out of his current situation. He tried to commit suicide with gas in his car and was later found lying in an alley in Riverad before being taken to hospital. The half-brother of G. Sao Paulo learned that his brother had accumulated 30,000 pounds of debt in just a few months, and added that the incident proved to be a turning point in life. Before he was quite outgoing. G said he would go out for a beer, laugh, and joke around, but after that he became a not very quiet. It was difficult to get anything out of him after his recovery. He undertook a 10-week trip to Thailand, spending all the money he had left on pills and prostitutes. He even sold his car and furniture to finance the trip, and when he returned he was forced to move in with his elderly father to avoid sleeping on the street, having hit rock bottom. He seems to have gone through a period of intense self-improvement while living with his father. He found a series of steady jobs that allowed him to be a member of a local golf club, and he was a regular visitor at the luxury hotel bar. This V was doing so well that he managed to start a relationship with a woman named Pamela, the same woman he would eventually move into Ipswich in 2004. The encounter marked a period of relative ability in the life of and before his move to Ipswich. Ipswich stopped frequenting brothels altogether, however, just months after moving to Tetka. Old habits returned with a vengeance. P began frequenting massage parlors, but in October 2006 she discovered that she could buy company for just £20 from the street prostitutes who surrounded me near her home. A woman claimed that OE had visited her TR days after the discovery of the last 2 victims was a regular client. I felt safe with him, he said, but that night he turned violent. He pinned me down, which he didn't usually do. It scared me because it wasn't his style. But when I heard that he had changed, I thought, oh God, I was at his house. He could have done anything to me. I never thought it was him. Babe's trial began on January 16, 2008. with his defense based on the idea that even though he was a regular visitor to the so-called red light district of Ipswich, he was not the murderer of the women. The prosecution raised the possibility that he had an accomplice, claiming that there was no evidence that the bodies of the victims had been dragged by a single person. Just a month later, on February 21st, and after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned unanimous verdicts against Get for the 5 crimes of murder, leading the prosecution to the prosecution, on the grounds that he should receive a sentence of life imprisonment and therefore never be released. The judge granted his request, and the next day he was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison in the custody of Her Majesty. Greg Bratso, Doug's brother-in-law, told the press that these crimes deserved the maximum punishment and that it could only mean one thing: death penalty or imprisonment. Human rights will be guarded by the state at great cost to the taxpayers of this country and emotionally to the families in mourning. However, Gulet's father was not so quick to call for violence when he said, "I am very relieved and satisfied for all the families that this is finally over. We can all begin to move on with our lives in peace. I worked for many years of my life. Although I liked the work, over time and due to strange circumstances, I decided to abandon it every morning. At 2:30 o'clock I got up to go milk the cows. I was never afraid to walk alone in that darkness. But as the days went by, something began to change. I always carried a flashlight to light the road, which was dark and full of stones. Sometimes I had the feeling of not being alone, as if someone was walking beside me. But I always chalked it up to tiredness. Was just a feeling, I thought." There was a stretch of the road surrounded by trees that led to a big descent down to the dairy on that particular night. Although the weather was calm, the air felt different, as if something or someone was watching me. As I entered the tree area, the cold suddenly enveloped me, and that made me quicken my pace. As I continued walking, I heard something that made me stop abruptly. They were footsteps, or at least that seemed as if the stones were moving right behind me. Although my heart told me that something was not right, I decided to ignore it and keep moving forward. However, as I went deeper, the noise and the feeling of being followed intensified. The footsteps were clearer, resonating with each movement. I took a deep breath. I stopped and looked around. There was no one there. I prepared to continue when suddenly I felt a hand rest on my shoulder. A cold hand, large and strong, that held me firmly, preventing me from moving forward. I was paralyzed. Although I wanted to run, my body did not respond. An instant later another hand clung to my hair, lifting me up and dragging me forward in the direction of the dairy. When we finally arrived at the farm, that it let go of me and disappeared during the day. That presence never manifested itself, but soon it became a regular event every morning. That thing held me by my hair almost every night. It wasn't long before it started to feel exhausted. I didn't know what to do or what it was that was following me or what I wanted from me. The fear of going to work, it took hold of me, and I finally decided to quit. When I did, what tormented me stopped appearing for almost a month. I felt relieved, thinking that I was done with that torment forever. One day, and with another job, I arrived home late. I lived with my brother Justino, and it was about 9 at night. I did my usual routine, smoked, drank a black coffee, ate something light, and then went to sleep. However, later at exactly 2:30 in the morning, I woke up wanting to go to the bathroom. I got up and went to the corridor that connected the rooms with the rest of the house. The corridor was long, dark, with wooden walls that made it seem narrower. As I advanced, I tripped over something, a large black lump. I immediately fell to the floor from fright. That it turned around, and to my horror I recognized its silhouette. It was the same thing that had followed me on the way to the dairy. I could finally see her clearly. She was tall, with the shape of a grown man, but she had no face, no eyes, mouth, absolutely nothing. That thing began to slowly approach, and I was paralyzed, unable to move. Thank God, my brother appeared behind me, quickly took my arm and led me to his room inside. He tried to calm me down while I told him what had happened. Justin took a crucifix that he had in the room and he handed it to me. He also took out a bottle of holy water that he had brought from the last Mass and sprinkled a little on the door. Then he opened it. That thing was at the end of the corridor, waiting as if he were watching us. Suddenly he began to run towards us. My brother, instead of backing up, stood firm, and when the creature was close enough, he threw the blessed AG on it. It began to writhe in a horrendous way on the ground, emitting chilling sounds. Only then my brother closed the door and began to pray. Of course I joined him in the prayer. The noises only stopped when the day began to dawn. The story of my great-grandfather ended there. But my grandmother said that she had also seen that thing. She used to see it on top of a tree near our home every night when I came home from work. However, she never had an encounter as close as my great-grandfather's. She also told me that I myself had already seen that creature when I was 5 years old. One night, while returning from the store, I saw it under the light of a pole lurking. In the shadows, Mexico City is a vibrant metropolis with its chaotic traffic, its unstoppable bustle, and its lights that they never go out but among their shadows. In the corners forgotten by modernity, old stories are still whispered. Stories that speak of pacts that few remember, but that many still fear. This is the story of Camila, a young journalist who, like many in the city, was looking for something more. Something that was beyond her reach. Camila was 28 years old and worked as an editor for a local magazine. Since she was a child, she had dreamed of to be a recognized writer, someone who not only told stories, but created them. However, as the years went by, she felt more and more trapped in an endless cycle of mediocre jobs, reports that did not interest her, a salary that barely allowed her to live in a small apartment in the center. What weighed on her most was not only the lack of recognition, but the feeling that her life lacked. I purposely felt that time passed without a trace, as if each day was a copy of the previous one. An afternoon after a particularly frustrating day in the newsroom, Camila received a text message from her best friend Valeria. There is an exhibition in a new place in the center, something very underground. I think you will be interested. Valeria was always aware of the strangest and most unknown events in the city, and Camila, who needed something to clear her mind, accepted the invitation. When they arrived at the place, an old industrial warehouse in an abandoned area, Camila noticed that there were not many attendees. The lighting was dim, almost non-existent, and the atmosphere had an air of clandestinity. The walls were covered with strange works of art, abstract drawings and sculptures that seemed to be made of unusual materials. However, what caught Camila's attention the most was not art, but a door at the end of the corridor, slightly ajar. A faint red light escaped through the crack. "I'm going to see what's back there," she said to Valeria, intrigued by the door. "Mysterious, I'll wait for you here," Cami replied her friend distractedly. With an installation of flickering lights, Camila approached the door, and without thinking about it, he pushed her gently as he entered. Found a small room lit only by red candles and a circle of symbols carved on the floor. There was a table in the center on which he reposed. An old and worn black notebook seemed out of place compared to the modern art of the cellar. He felt a chill run down his spine, but his curiosity was greater than his fear. He approached the notebook and slowly opened it. Pages were full of writings in an ancient language that she did not understand. However, on the first page, with a much more recent handwriting, there was a note in ESP: "For those who seek the impossible, here they will find it, but everything that is asked for has a price. Think well about your desire, and when you are ready, sign your name." Camila laughed to herself, thinking that this was some kind of artistic performance or joke. However, something inside pushed her to continue reading. She turned several pages until she reached another handwritten note. "Those who dare to sign here should know that what they ask for will be granted to them. But once they obtain their wish, something of equal value will be taken away from them. Every pact has its balance. There are no exceptions." The air in the room became heavy, and Camila felt like skin from her arms. She bristled. This could be real. Logic told her it was just another joke by the artist behind the exhibition. But her instinct pushed her to think of the legends she had once heard about ancient pacts in the city, a deal with forces beyond human comprehension. Tired of the aimless life that carried the temptation to ask for change, to get what had always been there. And if that notebook could give her the opportunity she had always dreamed of, the doubts began to, as her ambition grew stronger. She took a pen that rested next to the notebook, and with a mixture of nervousness and determination, she wrote her name, Camila Rodriguez, at the instant of signing. The candles flickering violently, and for a brief moment the room seemed to vibrate. The air became dense, and the shadows on the walls seemed to lengthen. It was then that she heard a soft but clear whisper, as if someone was right behind her. "Your wish will be granted," said the voice, cold and distant. "But the price is already decided." Camila turned around quickly, but there was no one. The cold sweat ran down her forehead and her heart was pounding. With nothing else to do, she quickly left the room, finding Valeria where she had left her. "Where did you get her into?" her friend asked her. "You've been in there for a while. You found something interesting." Camila didn't answer immediately, still processing what had just happened. "Nothing, just something strange," she murmured, trying to calm herself. That night, when she arrived at her apartment, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The strange feeling that there was after signing her name didn't go away. And although she tried to rationalize something, inside her she knew that she had crossed a line. The following days were a mixture of confusion and surprise. A week after that night in the bodega, Camila's life began to change drastically. An article she had written months ago about corruption in local politics was taken up by a renowned magazine from one day to the next. Her name began to appear everywhere. Job offers, interviews, and collaboration proposals suddenly began to rain down. Camila was the most sought-after journalist in the city. Her career that had been stagnant for years skyrocketed like never before. Everything seemed perfect, however. In the midst of all that success, strange things began to happen at first. Small incidents that could be missed, calls that were mysteriously cut off, shadows that seemed to move in the corners of her apartment, and even the constant feeling from being watched one night while checking some emails on her computer. The screen flickered and then turned off completely. The silence in her apartment was overwhelming, and she suddenly felt a whisper behind her, similar to what she had heard in the cellar room. "You already have what you wanted," said the voice, loaded with a strange satisfaction. "But the price is still pending." Camila turned quickly, but since that time there was no one. Fear began to take hold of her. She could not ignore what was happening. Something or someone was nearby waiting to collect the price she had agreed without realizing the true consequences. The days passed and the supernatural incidents intensified. Objects that disappeared and appeared in impossible places. Reflections that did not match reality. Shadows that followed her. Camila began to sleep badly. Her dreams became darker and darker in them. He was always in the same room with red candles, listening to the echo of his own voice, asking for something he could no longer remember. A night, unable to bear the uncertainty anymore, he decided to return to the place of the exhibition. It had been a month since the first time he visited the winery, but when he arrived everything had changed. The building was closed as if no one had been there in years. The paint peeled and the broken windows gave her a sense of total abandonment. How was it possible? Just a month ago that place was full of art, of desperate life. She began to investigate the history of the place, which she discovered took her breath away almost 20 years ago. A series of experimental artists had organized an exhibition in that same winery inspired by ancient and esoteric rituals shortly after its inauguration. The place was closed due to a tragedy. Several of the artists had disappeared without a trace, and others had been found mad, repeating over and over again that something had claimed their souls. Camila, now terrified, knew that she had fallen into a similar trap. The pact she had signed, believing it was foolish, now had her trapped, and even worse, the price was still to be paid. The nights became endless, and finally one early morning the moment arrived. She woke up in the middle of the night, with a sharp pain in her chest, as if something invisible was oppressing her. She opened her eyes, and in front of her bed she saw a dark, tall and thin figure with eyes that shone in the gloom. She did not speak, but Camila knew who it was. The same entity that had promised her success now came to claim her payment. She tried to move, to scream, but she was paralyzed. The being approached slowly, his presence filling the room with a deadly chill. When he was close enough, whispered in his ear, "Every pact has an end," and then, in the blink of an eye, everything went black. The next morning, the newspaper headlines announced the tragic death of Camila Rodriguez, the young journalist who had conquered the city. No one could explain the strange circumstances of her passing. But in the darkest circles among the who knew the legend of the pacts knew that Camila had gotten what she wanted, and had also paid the price in a small town on the outskirts of Guanajuato known as Cerro del Mirador. One of the most puzzling events the region has ever witnessed unfolded. It was an October night in 1984 when the first lights began to appear in the sky. Cerro del Mirador was a quiet place, famous for its panoramic views and the rumor of paranormal stories that had circulated among the locals for years. That night, however, something out of the ordinary was going to forever change the perception of the place. Were around 9 p.m. when a taxi driver, Javier Morales, was on his way back home after a long day of work, driving down a road that snaked near the Cerro when a flash of a green light suddenly lit up the sky. At first, I thought it was lightning. He later told journalists, however, what he saw next was completely different from any storm. A luminous sphere the size of a small truck floated a few meters above the trees of the hill, emitting flashes in green, blue, and yellow tones, pulsating in patterns that seemed to follow a kind of hypnotic rhythm. Fascinated and frightened at the same time, Javier stopped his taxi in its tracks. What worried him? The Most was that the engine suddenly stopped and the dashboard lights began to flicker before being completely extinguished in a matter of minutes. More people began to notice the lights in the sky. The inhabitants of the town, intrigued by the flashes that seemed to dance on the hill, left their houses. Some took internal and photographic cameras to go up to the viewpoint, while others opted Lupita, an old woman from the town, who observed the phenomenon from her window, had never seen anything like this. It was as if the sky was alive. The news of the strange phenomenon began to circulate quickly. Rumors reached the city of Leon, attracting journalists and curious onlookers among the visitors. There was a group of ufologists led by a renowned researcher on the subject, Professor Raul Sanchez. He had heard similar accounts in other parts of the country and wasted no time in traveling to Guanajuato to document the event. Meanwhile, on the hill, things began to get even stranger. Several locals reported that their watches stopped, their camera batteries were inexplicably discharged, and animals in the area acted erratically. A local man known as Don Jacinto claimed to have had a direct encounter with the lights. "I was collecting firewood when that thing came down right in front of me," he claimed, according to his account. He felt an intense heat and heard a piercing buzzing before losing consciousness. Don Jacinto became the focus of media attention. Some accused him of making up the story to get attention, while others were convinced that he had witnessed something extraordinary. What Vian was not of this world. He repeated in a firm voice, "That light seemed to be alive. I cannot explain it." The intensity of the phenomenon reached its peak when a group of local policemen sent to the hill to disperse the curious had an encounter that would change their lives. But that is a story that will unfold later. The policemen sent to the hill of the Mirador that night were CU Commander Pedro Vasquez, Officer Ricardo Alarcon, and the novices Hector and Martin. Their initial mission was simple: to clear the place of the curious who, due to rumors of the strange lights, had begun to gather in the area. However, what they found was very different from what they expected. When the team reached the highest accessible point of the Cerro, they discovered a group of about 20 people, among them journalists, ufologists, and residents of the town, all pointing to the sky. The lights were still there, shining with an intensity that made it difficult to keep your gaze fixed for long. Some seemed to float slowly, while others moved at angles impossible for any known aircraft. Commander Pedro tried to impose order. "We need you to withdraw. This could be dangerous," but his words barely had an impact. The witnesses were hypnotized, as if the light show in the sky held them against their will. It was then that something even stranger happened. One of the lights began to descend slowly, approaching the group. Those present backed away, some screaming in terror, while others took out their cameras in a desperate attempt to capture the moment. The luminous sphere of an electric blue stopped about 15 meters from the ground. At that moment, the flashlights and radios of the policemen dropped. If it worked, the screams ceased, leaving only a deafening silence. "Commander, what do we do?" Hector asked with a trembling voice. But Pedro did not have an answer. They were all paralyzed, as if their bodies did not respond. It was then that the light began to pulsate, emitting intermittent flashes that seemed to follow a specific pattern. Officer Ricardo, who was known for his skeptical nature, tried to approach the light. "It must be some kind of drone or something similar," he muttered, trying to convince himself. Took a step forward, and suddenly the light pulsed with a Cadora intensity. Ricardo fell to the ground, apparently unharmed but deeply shocked. It was not a physical blow, I would say later. It was as if something entered my head like a message that I could not understand. While this was happening, Professor Raul Sanchez and his team were trying to decipher the pattern of the lights with a rudimentary equipment of recording that miraculously was still working. "This is not random," exclaimed one of his assistants. "It is a code," although they could not decipher it at the time. Raul was convinced that the lights were trying to communicate. The climax of the night came when a second sphere, this time of an intense red color, appeared in the sky and began to emit a deep sound, like a metallic hum that resounded. In the air, the trees trembled and the ground seemed to vibrate under the feet of those present, some as they ran down the hill, while others, unable to move, remained watching with a mixture of fascination and terror. Commander Pedro finally reacted by ordering his officers to withdraw from the place. However, before they could do so, the red light released a final flash that illuminated the entire hill, and then, along with the other lights, the darkness completely disappeared, and the silence that followed his departure was almost as disturbing as the lights themselves. In the following days, the town was full of rumors and speculations. Some claimed that the lights were visitors from another world, while others were convinced that they were secret military experiments. Don Jacinto, who continued to defend his story, was interviewed by several local television networks, but was also the object of ridicule and skepticism for, on the other hand, Professor Raul Sanchez and his team analyzed the recordings and stated that the luminous pattern could be a form of interstellar communication. However, without conclusive evidence, their theories were discarded by the most conservative scientific community. Although the event disappeared from the headlines after a few weeks, the marks it left on the community persisted for decades. Some claimed that after that night they had begun to dream of luminous figures, that they showed them images of strange landscapes. Others reported recurrent electrical failures in their homes, as if the very energy of the place had been altered. The Cerro del Mirador was never the same again. The stories of that night remained as an echo in the collective memory of the people, a mixture of fear and wonder that made it difficult to distinguish reality from fantasy. The impact of that night on Cerro del Mirador was not the same. It took time to spread beyond the small town. As the witnesses shared their experiences with family members and acquaintances, the stories began to attract more attention from the national press. Renowned journalists came to the scene looking for interviews and evidence that could confirm or discredit the accounts. One of the most intriguing pieces that emerged was an audio recording recovered by Professor Raul Sanchez's team. Although the video images that were used to provide information on the story were not the same, as the microphone managed to record the strange hum that accompanied the lights. The sound, when played, provoked a sense of uneasiness difficult to describe, as if it aroused something primitive in those who listened to it. Even the audio experts who analyzed the tape admitted that they could not identify its origin. Meanwhile, the individual stories of the witnesses began to take on a more disturbing character. One of the most notorious cases was that of Andrea, a 19-year-old girl who climbed the hill with her boyfriend that night. According to her account, when she looked directly at the blue sphere that had approached the group, she felt a strange pressure in her head and lost track of time. When she came to, she claimed to have seen fleeting images of a place that she could not locate, a vast, desolate landscape under a dark sky with structures that seemed to float in the air. These visions haunted her for weeks, affecting her sleep and mental health. Another case that generated speculation was that of Officer Ricardo Alarcón. After his direct interaction with light, she began to experience episodes of INS and headaches that doctors could not explain. However, what was most striking was that Ricardo seemed to have developed an unusual sensitivity to electric fields, claimed to be able to sense when a device was on, even meters away. Skeptics dismissed this as a simple suggestion, but the most believers saw it as proof that he had been marked by the entities behind the lights. Commander Pedro, who had led the group of policemen, remained more reserved about what happened. Although he never denied what he saw, he avoided talking about the subject in public. However, in a private interview with a journalist, admitted to having felt a deep fear that night. It was not a normal fear, he confessed. It was as if he knew deep down that we were facing something we could not control or understand. As the months went by, the media interest in the case began to fade. But for the inhabitants of the town, the event continued to be a source of debate and speculation. Some claimed that the lights would return, while others avoided mentioning the subject, afraid of attracting what they had witnessed. Professor Raul Sanchez, for his part, spent years studying the data collected that night. Although his efforts failed to obtain official recognition from the scientific community, his research became cult material for ufology enthusiasts. In one of his last reports before retiring, Sanchez claimed to be convinced that the lights, they were not a natural or human phenomenon. I don't know if they were visitors from another world or from another dimension, he wrote, but what happened in the zero of the adoration left us with a message that we have not yet managed to decipher. Decades later, the hill is still a place of mystery. Some tourists visit it in the hope of experiencing something similar, while others come in search of answers. However, the locals know that what they are doing. What happened that night cannot be recreated or explained. The sky of Cerro del Mirador keeps its secrets, and lights, although absent, remain alive in the memory of those who saw them. My name is Esteban. I was born in Aguascalientes, but since I was a child I moved with my grandmother to a small town on the outskirts of San Luis Potosí. Our house was modest, surrounded by leafy trees and with a small stream that meandered behind it. From the property to return home after work, I had two options: a steep and dark path that bordered a ravine about 30 m deep, or a path that crossed an old abandoned cemetery. The path of the barranco was always in darkness, because although there were lampposts, thieves used to break the lamps and the place remained immersed in darkness. On the other hand, the path of the cemetery, although it was chilling, was more direct. I often chose the latter, because the remains of my parents rested there, and somehow that gave me a certain peace. However, there was something disturbing in both paths of the barranco. They said that some nights a woman was heard crying. Some neighbors claimed to have seen her silhouette wandering in the shadows, and others, more superstitious, affirmed that it was an apparition that dragged the unwary into the void. That particular night I left work late. It was almost 10 o'clock when I managed to board the last bus. When I got off at my stop, the air was fresh and the silence heavy. I adjusted my backpack to my shoulder, and with quick steps I entered the cemetery. In the distance, barely illuminated by an old flashing lantern, I saw the figure of a girl, wearing a white dress like First Communion, but dirty and torn. I was walking slowly, with her head down and her bare feet barely touching the ground. At first I didn't give it too much importance. Maybe it was a girl from one of the nearby houses who had gone out to look for something. But when I crossed the last row of graves, I noticed something strange. The girl had not left the cemetery, but she was not there either. I looked around. The lantern was still flickering, and the wind was raising a fine dust that was sneaking through my nostrils. I quickened my pace. When I reached the main street, I passed in front of an old high school that, due to the constant robberies in the area, was well lit under those yellowish lights. I could clearly see that the girl was now walking a few meters in front of me. Her dress was fluttering in the wind, and her long dark hair covered part of her face. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and by instinct I took it out to check a notification. Just a few seconds passed, but when I looked up, the girl was no longer there. I looked sideways, backwards, nothing. Just the distant echo of a barking dog and the whisper of the wind. I came home with my heart beating at 1,000 per hour. My grandmother was already asleep, so I entered through the back door, which led directly to my room. To open the door, a foul smell hit my face. It was as if something was rotten inside my room. I looked for the switch and turned on the light, and there she sat on the edge of my bed, the child. Her dress was covered with damp earth and dry leaves. Her pale and dirty hands rested on her knees. But the worst thing was her face, her empty eyes, her livid skin, and her lips that were unclear. They curved into a smile that didn't seem human. Terror paralyzed me for an instant, but my body reacted before my mind, and I ran to the house of my neighbor Felipe, a childhood friend. I knocked on his door desperately until he came out accompanied by his brother-in-law. They gave them everything I had seen, and although they tried to calm me down, I noticed that their faces also reflected concern. The three of us returned to my house armed with flashlights and a rosary that Felipe had taken from his mother. But when I entered, there was nothing. No smell, no girl, no trace of dirt on my bed. Only a cold and heavy silence that made us get out of there as quickly as possible. Felipe recommended that I get a cleanse, that perhaps a spirit from the cemetery had clung to me. The next day I told my grandmother everything, but she, although worried, she insisted that it had probably been my imagination playing tricks on me. Months have passed since that night, but I still dream of that macabre smile and those empty eyes. Sometimes when I am alone in my room, I feel a faint smell of damp earth, and I hear a barely audible whisper that calls me by my name. There are objects that carry more than the weight of matter. They are portals to dark secrets and curses forgotten by time. One of those objects is a diary, apparently harmless, lost among dusty old books in a flea market. For whoever finds it, it is just one more curious item. But for those who know its true history, it is an artifact of pure terror. The blood diary, as it has been dubbed by ancient collectors, has the power to transfer curses and imprison souls, and once it is opened and read, the consequences are inevitable. My name is Elena, and I am an ordinary person who lived a life that until recently I considered normal. I grew up in a small town in the interior of Mexico where everyone knew each other, and I spent most of my childhood and adolescence surrounded by books, which led me to choose a career in literature. Working as an editor in an independent publishing house gave me a modest satisfaction. But what I really loved was visiting book fairs and flea markets in search of literary rarities. That's how I found the newspaper one Saturday morning. The weather was strange. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and the air had a sticky humidity that foreshadowed a storm. Even so, I decided to go to the flea market that was held weekly in the center of town. Walking through the stone streets full of trinkets and old books, something caught my eye in a secluded corner, almost out of sight. An elderly man was selling a collection of old books. The pile seemed about to collapse, but something shone between the books, a small dark leather journal with the edges worn by time. There was something peculiar about the way it glistened in the gray light of the morning. I took it in my hands, feeling the rough texture of aged leather. At first I thought it was a blank notebook, but when I opened it I realized I was wrong. The pages were filled with neat calligraphy. Although somewhat inclined, as if the writer had been in a hurry or nervous, the man at the stall was watching me closely, and when I asked the price I hesitated before accepting a trifling sum. When I took the diary I felt a strange change in but what disturbed me the most was the salesman's expression as he handed me the book more gently. "Be careful." His words echoed in my mind as I walked away, not knowing that this notice must have been taken much more seriously. Back in my apartment, curiosity consumed me. I sat in the living room and began to read the story narrated in the diary. It was intriguing about a man named Augustus, who lived in the 19th century, described his life in detail, but soon there was something dark in his account. Augustus spoke of a pact he had made with a shadowy entity in exchange for immortality, but like all dealings with supernatural forces, there was a price. He was trapped in an endless cycle of grief and loss, where everyone around him died while he remained young, but terribly alone as he went along. As I read, the words began to resonate strangely, as if they were addressed to me. The descriptions became more and more vivid, as if I myself were living the story of Augustus. The shadows in my apartment lengthened, and the air grew colder. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept reading, unable to stop. It was then that I realized that the diary was not just a story, it was an invitation, a portal to something much more sinister. The text began to distort on the pages, and a new calligraphy, a writing that was not Augusto's, appeared. It was as if the newspaper was communicating directly with me, as if it wanted to tell me something. That night, the first signs that something was not right began to manifest themselves in the darkness of the apartment. I heard small noises, sounds as if something or someone was moving in my house. Convinced that it was my imagination, I tried to ignore it, but the discomfort was real. The lights began to flicker and I felt a constant presence that watched me. The nights became unbearable, full of nightmares in which I saw myself trapped in an unknown house, with walls that moved and shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. A dark being was always behind me, watching, waiting, waking up in the middle of the night. A night soaked in sweat, my heart pounding, knowing that something was very wrong. The following days the situation worsened. Objects in my apartment moved on their own. The lights flickered more and more, and the newspaper appeared in different places. Even if I had left it on the table, my friends didn't believe me when I told them. They thought I was stressed, but I knew something else was going on. Something had changed in me since I opened that diary finally. One rainy night everything peaked. I heard a loud noise coming from the living room. I ran and I found the diary open, with the pages moving on their own. The air was icy and the presence was overwhelming. I tried to close the book, but something invisible prevented it. The shadows began to take shape and a dark figure materialized. "Read what you shouldn't," muttered the figure. "Now you belong to it." I tried to escape, but I felt a deep cold and a force that paralyzed me. The figure extended its hand, and when it touched me, an indescribable agony ran through my body. I knew that something was trying to possess me, to infiltrate my being. The shadows were closing around me, but I managed to run, get out of the house, and seek help. In the days that followed, the shadows followed me wherever I went. I knew that the curse of the diary would make me. I had caught in one last attempt to break the cycle. I went back to the flea market, but the man who sold me the diary was gone. No one seemed to remember it. In despair, I went back home and found the diary again opened, with a new inscription: "You can't escape me." I knew I had to destroy it. I took the diary and threw it on the fire. As the flames consumed the pages, I heard a heart-wrenching scream. As if the diary itself felt pain, the dark figure of Augusto disappeared. But I knew that not everything was over. The curse had not been completely destroyed, only dormant. Now, as I write these words, I feel the darkness approaching again. I know that the cycle is not over, and that someday someone will find the ashes of the newspaper rekindling the curse. Evil never rests, always waiting for its next victim. On a dark and stormy night in Mexico City, a urban legend was whispered among the corridors of a prestigious law firm located in one of the most imposing skyscrapers in the financial center. A legend that, although known by few, it never ceased to shake those who listened to it. The old employees of the firm shared it in a low voice, especially with the new interns when the echo of their footsteps resounded in the long marble corridors. It was the story of Ignacio Lara, a lawyer famous not only for his success but for his eccentric and reckless character. Ignacio, like many of his colleagues, had a luxurious office on the floor 22 of a building made almost entirely of glass, which offered breathtaking views of the city. But more than the views, what fascinated Ignacio was the thickness and supposed invulnerability of the huge windows that surrounded his office. The company in charge of manufacturing and installing the glass assured that its products were practically indestructible, capable of withstanding even the strongest blows, it was said. That not even a bullet could break those windows. This awakened in Ignacio a dangerous obsession. Every time he had important visitors, Ignacio did not miss the opportunity to impress his guests with a trick that many found chilling after a few glasses of wine and some laughter. He announced in a theatrical tone, "Goodbye, cruel world," and without warning he ran with all his strength to one of the windows. The astonished guests watched in horror as Ignacio he threw himself against the glass only to see it bounce back laughing out loud while the glass remained intact. This trick that at first seemed like a harmless joke became a dangerous habit. Ignacio, blinded by adrenaline and the desire to impress, repeated the act over and over again with increasing strength, convinced that nothing bad could happen. But one fateful night in front of a group of young law students who were visiting the law firm, Ignacio's luck changed forever that day. As so many other times, Ignacio wanted to leave. In front of the students, he braced himself, gained momentum and ran to the window confident that as always he would bounce against the glass. However, when his body hit the window the glass did not break, but something much worse happened. The old supports that held the frame corroded by the years and the repeated thrusts took place. The video panel slid out of place and before Ignacio could react, he fell into the void screaming as he plunged 22 stories down until he crashed against the pavement. The silence that followed was sepulchral. The students, pale and terrified, witnessed an event that they would never forget. Ignacio Lara, the lawyer who always defied danger, had met his end in the most absurd way and unexpectedly possible. Days later the press was filled with headlines about the tragic accident, but what most baffled many was the official explanation. The glass did not break. The frame had simply failed due to wear and tear and poor maintenance. The company that had manufactured the windows was quick to clarify that their product had not failed, but that the installation had been deficient. The law firm where Ignacio worked never recovered of the impact of his death. In less than 3 years the firm closed its doors forever, shrouded in rumors of mismanagement and internal disputes. But those who were present that fateful day spoke of something else. They said that Ignacio's spirit never left the building. Some employees claimed to have heard muffled laughter and quick footsteps, as if someone were running through the corridors in the middle of the night. Others claimed to have felt a cold presence near the windows, as if Ignacio were still there, repeating his dangerous joke. Despite efforts to debunk these accounts, Ignacio Lara's story became a grim warning, a reminder of how fatal arrogance and impudence, and while many wished the story was just an urban legend, the truth was far more terrifying. One man had lost his life to a joke that had come out terribly bad. Juan was a 15-year-old boy from a deeply religious family. Every Sunday he attended Mass in a small town in the interior of Mexico accompanied by his parents. He was an educated, studious boy and had never been involved in any kind of problem. However, one day he met a girl named Mariana, who was the opposite of Juan. Mariana drank, used drugs, and had a strange fondness for visit the cemetery at night, where she desecrated graves and mocked the dead who rested there. Juan, being a naive young man, he fell in love with her. Mariana was a very pretty girl, but she was always in trouble wherever she went. Soon Juan began to accompany her on her night visits to the cemetery, and before he knew it, he was already drinking and using drugs frequently. One night, while they were in the cemetery, Mariana, she downloaded an application on her cell phone that claimed to be able to communicate with the world of the dead. The application only required entering the full name of a person and their date of death. Mariana looked for the most sinister tomb she could find. There was no known cross or religious symbol on it, but a kind of angel carved in stone, but very different from the Christian angels. This angel rode a black horse and held a trident instead of a sword. It also seemed to have 2 small horns on its head. The young people took the name of the tombstone, where the photo of a middle-aged man with long hair and a mustache was seen. His first name was Vladimir, and he had died in 1879. They entered the data into the app and started asking questions, mainly if there was anyone there soon. The app answered affirmatively. When they asked who was there, the application replied that it was exactly the person they had invoked. The young people decided to ask how that man had died, but they did not get an answer. Then they asked if the man was a good or evil spirit, and he answered that he was not a confused spirit. The young people asked what it was, and the man replied that he was a fallen angel, a demon that had taken the body of Vladimir, who had been part of a satanic sect and had offered himself to the Prince of Darkness. He added that he was looking for another body to be able to roam the earth. At that moment, the young people were filled with terror, and the man told them that he would possess John's body, but that it would only be possible when he was asleep. Immediately they turned off the cell phone and deleted the application, returning to their home scared. John decided not to sleep all night for fear of being possessed by that demon. Mariana was talking to him on his cell phone until approximately 2:30 in the morning, but eventually she fell asleep and stopped answering Juan's messages, who was also very tired. Around 3 in the morning, Juan felt a strong tiredness and fell asleep. A strong smell of burning invaded Juan's house, and his mother heard noises coming from her room. When she was opened the door, had a terrifying experience. Juan was glued to the ceiling of his room as if he were a spider, speaking in unknown languages. His terrified mother woke up her husband, and they immediately called the priest of the church they frequented. The priest, upon receiving the call, quickly went to the house of Juan's family. However, when passing through a crossroads in the middle of the road, the 4 tires of the car exploded. He was still far from the house, and he would have to walk about 2 km when he got out of his car carrying his Bible and his cassock. He was surprised by a man with a black hat and red eyes. The priest began to pray, and the demon disappeared in front of him. He walked a good stretch, and when he reached the street where Juan lived, he could already hear screams coming from the house. The whole neighborhood was without electric power, knocked on the door, and was greeted by Juan's mother, who had a pale face and could not say anything. He was only crying inconsolably when he entered the house. The priest asked Juan's parents to help him hold him to the bed and then to leave the room, warning them that the demon was a liar and would use any trick to enter the mind of another person or possess another body. The priest began the exorcism ritual by praying and sprinkling holy water on John's body, who was writhing and groaning in pain. John uttered insults in Latin, Greek, and Aramaic. At one point he managed to break the ropes that bound one of his hands and hit the priest hard, making him fall to the ground. Despite being stunned, the priest continued the ritual with all his faith. After many hours he came out from the exhausted room. Juan's parents waited anxiously in the living room of the house. The priest told them that he had managed to expel the demon from Juan's body, but he asked them who it was. A person named Mariana. The parents explained that it was a friend that Juan had recently met, and that they never tried that friendship because they knew that she was a drug addict and was very rebellious. The priest explained that the demon mentioned that name insistently, saying that she had summoned him, and that now she was leaving Juan's body to possess Mariana's forever. The next day, Juan did not remember anything of what happened. Early in the morning around 7 o'clock, he received a call from Mariana, who asked him to meet her at the cemetery, stating that she had discovered a way to break the bend. Immediately Juan went to find her. Her parents were still asleep. When he entered the cemetery, he saw that she was in front of the tomb that they had visited and desecrated the night before. Mariana was on her back, dressed completely in black with a hat on her head. Juan called her by her name, but she did not answer, remaining with his back turned all the time. When he approached her and touched her shoulder, he received a stab wound in the chest that killed him instantly. The police quickly arrived at the scene and arrested Mariana. They discovered that he had murdered his entire family with the same knife with which he killed Juan. He never mentioned his real name or remembered his identity again, and is currently serving a sentence in a judicial asylum, where he receives sessions of every day. The doctor who treats her says that Mariana suffers from a personality disorder and that she has assumed the identity of a man who said his name was Vladimir, does not remember anything about her past, and the doctors never believed that she was possessed. Today Mariana takes many medications to keep her less aggressive, and sometimes the doctors have to give way. We decided to travel to a small town in the north of Mexico, a place that, according to what we had been told, had something very special. The cobblestone streets, the colonial-style houses, and the main square that seemed to be taken from a postcard gave a unique feeling. Near the square there was a statue that caught our attention. It was made of bronze so detailed that when looking at it, it seemed to be observing every movement around it. In front of the square, there was a small hotel where we decided to stay. The room was modesto, but it had a window that looked directly onto the statue. What a beautiful view! Don't you think so, Ella? I told her as I left my suitcase on the bed. She was looking at the statue, but something on her face said that it made her uncomfortable. The eyes of the figure seemed so real, so intense that they gave her chills, quite disturbing. Local truth and try some of Lost Delicious, typical of the place, the people of the town. Seemed calm and the night progressed smoothly, but everything changed when we returned to the hotel. Shortly after we went to bed, Mariella began to complain. She complained of a strong pain in her stomach, something that usually happened to her at that time of the month. I tried to calm her down, but I knew what that meant. I'm going to find some remedies for you. I didn't take long, I told her while I covered it with a blanket. Before leaving, I went to the window to see how the street was. We had been warned that the center of the town was not always safe to walk at night. The day could seem perfect, but the night brought with it a different air, denser, more disturbing. When I looked at the square, I noticed something strange. The statue was no longer there. I looked twice, trying to understand if it was an error of perception, the place where I had been. Now I only had a diffuse shadow. For a moment I tried to justify it, thinking that it could be a play of light or tiredness. However, something in my chest told me that there was something strange. Something that did not fit. I could not stay there thinking about it, because Mariella was still suffering. So I went quickly to the exit. The lady at the reception, a woman older man, who always wore a woolen shawl over his shoulders, stopped me before I could walk through the door. "He's going to leave at this time?" he asked me, almost whispering. "Yes, I need to go to the pharmacy. My girlfriend is in a lot of pain," I replied. The lady frowned. No, young man, it's not a good time to walk around. Not this or any other. Better wait until dawn." "I can't wait," I insisted. Without, she looked at me with a serious expression as if she wanted to warn me of something. But finally she nodded. "Take care of yourself," she murmured as she let me out. The streets were deserted, much more than I had imagined. The light from the streetlights was scarce, and in every step I took was heard in the empty street like an echo. I felt as if I was walking through a place forgotten by time. I quickly arrived at the pharmacy, more anxious to return than anything else. The pharmacist barely paid attention to me, handed me the remedies, and I hurried to leave. On the way back, I began to hear something strange. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the footsteps were clear and close, as if someone was following me. I looked back, but I saw no one. I thought I might be tired. But as I accelerated my pace, I heard how the footsteps behind me were also picking up their pace. I felt nervous, but I decided not to look any further back. I just wanted to get to the hotel and be in a safe place. When I finally came back, I could almost hear my heart pounding in my ears. The lady at the front desk was still there, staring at me as if she knew something I didn't understand. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with an expression that made me feel uncomfortable. I quickly went up the stairs and locked the door of the room. Mariella was asleep, breathing calmly. I left the medicines next to her and tried to calm down, but something was still disturbing. I went to the window and looked towards the square. The statue was still there in the same place, with the same dust accumulated at its base. It seemed as if it had never disappeared, as if nothing had happened that night. I couldn't sleep well. I woke up several times feeling that something was watching me from the darkness of the square the next morning. When the sun lit up the place, I was in her place, just as we had seen her when we arrived. I never told Mariella what happened that night. I didn't want to worry her, but deep down I knew that something strange had happened. Something that I could never explain. In a small neighborhood on the outskirts of Mexico City called La Colina, life seemed to go on normally. It was a place where everyone knew each other, and the houses, although modest, were well maintained. Children played in the streets. Housewives chatted on street corners, and old people sat on their porches to enjoy the cool of the afternoon. However, under that appearance of tranquility there was a dark story that many preferred not to mention. A secret buried in the foundations of that neighborhood. The neighborhood had been built on what was once a forgotten cemetery. The first inhabitants did not know this, but over time those who had lived there longer began to notice strange things. Small details at first, a whisper in the night, shadows that moved in the corners, lights that flickered for no apparent reason. However, what really began to worry the neighbors were the disappearances. The first to disappear was Dona Carmen, an elderly woman who lived alone at the end of the main street. She was known for being a kind woman, although a little lonely, who always took care of her garden with care. One day she just stopped leaving her house. Her worried neighbors called the police. When they entered her home they found no trace of her. The most disturbing thing was that in her garden, Where she was I used to work every afternoon, there was a small stone figure that no one had seen before. A figure that according to some neighbors had an uncanny resemblance to Donna Carmen. The disappearances continued. First it was a child playing in the street at dusk, then a young delivery man who used to make deliveries in the neighborhood. They all disappeared without a trace, and in each of the cases a stone figure appeared somewhere nearby, always with a disturbing resemblance to the missing person. The neighbors began to talk to each other, whispering theories and suspicions. Some said that the neighborhood was cursed, that the spirits of the cemetery claimed what was theirs. Others thought that some neighbor had gone mad and that the stone figures were the work of a deranged murderer. But no one had proof, and fear began to take over the hill. Among the neighbors there was a couple, young Laura and Daniel, who had recently moved to the neighborhood. At first did not pay much attention to the rumors, believing that they were just superstitions of older people. However, as the disappearances continued, they began to worry. Laura in particular felt a constant uneasiness, as if something dark was always lurking in the corner of her vision, something she could not explain. One night, while Kit was at work, Laura heard a noise coming from outside. It was a soft sound, as if someone was dragging something heavy on the sidewalk. She looked out the window, and in the dim street light she saw a shadow moving slowly in front of the house. Her heart pounding as she tried to discern what it was. The shadow stopped right in front of her door. Laura saw a shiver run down her spine. She couldn't see clearly who or that she was outside. She took her phone and called CS, asking her to come home as soon as possible. While she waited, the minutes seemed eternal. She finally heard her husband's car approaching, and when the lights illuminated the street, the shadow had disappeared. Charette did not find anything out of the ordinary, but Laura's uneasiness did not dissipate. Days later, Laura began to notice small changes in the house, things that seemed to move. One night while she was sleeping, she felt as if someone was watching her. She woke up startled but did not see anyone. However, the feeling of being observed did not disappear. She began to have recurring nightmares in which she walked through the streets of the neighborhood and found the stone figures, all with familiar faces. All the disappeared stared at her, accusing her with their empty eyes. Daniel tried to calm her down by telling her that they were only she dreamed, that everything was okay, but Laura knew something was wrong. While Laura felt increasingly isolated and desperate, one night Laura decided that she needed answers. She had heard that Donna Alicia, an old woman who had lived in the neighborhood since its foundation, knew more than she had told. Even though she was late the hour she went to her house, Donna Alicia received her with some reluctance, but seeing the desperation in Laura's eyes, she agreed to speak. The old woman told her the story of the cemetery, of how the souls of those who had been forgotten cried out for justice. However, she also revealed something more terrifying. They are not just souls in pain, she said in a trembling voice. Something darker has awakened here, something that feeds on fear, something that takes the form of those who have disappeared. Laura listened with horror as Donna Alicia described the entity, a shadow that roamed the neighborhood in search of new victims. According to the old woman, this entity could influence people's minds, make them see things that were not there, or worse, make them disappear without a trace, turning them into those stone figures. The revelation left Laura terrified. She returned home with the feeling that something was following her, something she could not. When Kilu returned from work, he found Laura in a state of trembling with fear. He tried to calm her down, but she just repeated over and over again that they had to leave, that they couldn't stay one more minute in that place. Daniel, believing that Laura was on the verge of a collapse, agreed to leave that same night. They packed the essentials and left the house, leaving everything behind what they couldn't take with them. As they drove away from the neighborhood, Laura felt a strange calm, as if a heavy load had been lifted from her shoulders. However, what she didn't know was that the shadow hadn't stayed on the hill. As they drove through the empty streets, Daniel began to feel a strange pressure in his chest, a feeling of cold that he couldn't explain. He looked in the rearview mirror, and for a second she thought she saw a dark figure sitting in the back seat, but when she turned to look, there was nothing. They arrived at a small hotel on the outskirts of the city, and they decided to spend the night there. Laura, still trembling, fell asleep shortly after entering the room, exhausted by stress. Daniel, however, could not sleep. He sat on the bed looking towards the door of the room with a strange feeling that something was about to happen. Hours passed, and the feeling of uneasiness did not disappear. Kit heard a soft murmur as if someone was talking on the other side of the door. She got up slowly and approached to listen better. At first she could not understand what was being said, but little by little the words became clearer. Laura, Laura, come with us. She felt a chill run down her spine, opened, slamming the door, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there. She closed the door quickly, and when she turned around she saw a shadow cross the room heading towards the bed where Laura was sleeping. Daniel ran towards her. But when the shadow arrived it had already disappeared. Laura woke up startled, feeling Daniel's presence next to her. But when she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her retreat. Something in her gaze had changed, as if it wasn't really him. Daniel tried to calm her down, but his words sounded hollow, empty, as if someone else was talking through him. Laura tried to get out of bed, but Daniel stopped her, his hand squeezing her shoulders tightly. "You can't tell you," Laura said in a voice that wasn't hers. "She chose you." Laura fought to release herself, panic taking hold of her. She screamed with all her might, but her screams were drowned out by the sound of an icy wind that filled the room. The shadow had returned, and this time she was not willing to let her go. In the middle of the fight, Laura managed to push Kagis, who fell to the ground unconscious, ran to the door, but before she could even open it, she felt a freezing cold surround her. The shadow was behind her, whispering in her ear, filling her mind with darkness. Laura shouted one last before it all faded into nothingness. The next morning, the hotel staff found the room empty. There was no sign of Laura or Daniel, just a small, delicate stone figure resting on the bed. No one ever knew what happened to them. But since then, the rumor of the hill spread to other neighborhoods. It was said that once the shadow found you, no matter how far away you would always be, I would follow you. The neighbors of the hill continued with their lives, but they never forgot the story of Laura and Daniel. Every time a new stone figure appeared in the neighborhood, they knew that the shadow had claimed a new victim, and so the legend of the curse of the cabbage was kept alive. A reminder that in the darkest corners of the neighborhood something lurks, waiting patiently for the next victim fell into their clutches. It was a cold and wet early morning in November. The clock struck 4:15 in the morning when Carlos, a young man with a driver who worked delivering goods between cities, was crossing a lonely stretch of the highway towards Valle de Bravo. He had decided to leave at that time to avoid traffic and take advantage of the tranquility offered by the night. The fog was thick, almost like a gray wall. That was, he swallowed the lights of his truck, driving slowly and with the lights low so as not to dazzle with the reflection of the fog. Carlos felt a chill run down his back. In a sharp curve, he saw what seemed to be several people walking on the side of the road. He slowed down, turned on the flashing lights, and prepared to overtake them carefully. However, something caught his attention. The people were not carrying flashlights, reflectors, or any kind of. They were walking slowly, with their heads down and dressed in gray clothes that seemed worn out by time and weather. Carlos thought that perhaps they were day laborers who had left very early to work, but something in the way they moved was unnatural to him, almost as if they were floating on the asphalt. He managed to overtake them and continued on his way, although with a strange feeling in his chest. But a few minutes later, in another sharp curve, he saw them again. They were the same figures in the same clothes and the same slow pace. Carlos' heart began to beat hard. How was it possible that they were there again, if he had not seen them pass? He decided to stay behind them for a few minutes, because the road was too narrow and dangerous to attempt another overtake. While he was moving slowly, he thought of touching to get their attention. Perhaps he could ask them to move a little so that he could pass. The sound of the horn. One of the figures slowed his pace and separated from the group. Carlos slowed down even more, and with his heart beating in his throat, he aligned himself with that silhouette. What he saw left him petrified. The face of that figure had no eyes, no nose or mouth, was like a shadow, deep and empty, that absorbed the light of the headlights. However, Carlos felt that this thing was staring at him, that it was watching him from that formless darkness. Fear took hold of him. He pressed the accelerator and shot away, ignoring the curves and the danger of the fog. But his nightmare did not end there. Later he saw the same group of figures again, and one of them slowly raised an arm as if he was asking him to stop. Carlos didn't. He stepped on the accelerator harder and continued driving without looking back. After several kilometers of anguish, he finally reached a small intersection where he saw a police patrol parked, braked abruptly, got out of the truck shaking, and approached the officers. "There are people on the road. They don't have lights. They don't have faces. They are out there," the police managed to say between gasps. They exchanged serious glances. One of them, with a calm gesture, tried to calm him down. "Friend, it is not the first time we have heard something like this." The officer explained that just a week earlier, an app driver had recounted a very similar experience on the same stretch of road. No one knew exactly what those figures were or why they always appeared in that area, but several witnesses agreed on the same details. Carlos decided to wait next to the officers until dawn when the sun finally lit up the sky and the road became busier. He got into his truck and continued his journey. Since that night, Carlos continues to cross that stretch of road, but he has never looked directly at the shadows that may appear on his way again. It was a dark early morning, one of those that seemed to last forever. The clock struck around 1:30 in the morning when I decided to take an exit off the road to make a stop at a gas station that was completely insulated, surrounded by the sun, by nothingness. Exhaustion had left me somewhat dazed, but enough to make the stop. My mind was already in automatic mode, like when long hours of driving disconnect you from the outside world. When I approached the pump, everything seemed normal. The lights of the gas station were shining softly, and the sound of the wind moving the dry leaves, it was the only thing that broke the silence. I began to fill the tank, fixing my gaze on the marker of the pump, while I made sure not to overdo it with the amount of gasoline. The monotony of that moment remained intact until I decided to walk to the small ATM booth. It was then when something strange caught my attention. The booth was empty. At first I thought that the cashier had gone to the bathroom or something like that, but as my eyes swept around the place, I realized that something didn't fit. The car parked at the pump in front of mine was also empty. There was no sign of the driver either in his car or inside the gas station store. A cold feeling came over me, and my mind immediately began to formulate ideas. I thought maybe the driver and the gas station attendant were busy somewhere else in the station, but the place looked more like a desert. One strange feeling of uneasiness made me sit still for a moment, observing the surroundings more carefully. Then the thought began to form in my mind, and if all this was related to an assault, suddenly my perception of safety changed. I began to feel vulnerable. I approached the vehicle parked in front of me, looking out of the corner of my eye. The BMW 3 Series 2011 I was driving, even though it was not an easy car to drive. Stealing the feeling that something wasn't right made me even more cautious. I watched more thoroughly, looking towards the store and then towards the road. At first I thought I should be prudent and leave, but something inside me forced me to stay. With a sigh, I knocked on the glass of the store and asked loudly, "There is someone there?" I knocked again and then again. The answer did not come. The anguish began to grow inside me as the repetitions of my knocks on the glass didn't alter the absolute emptiness of the place. After a while I didn't know what to think. My heart was pounding, and a feeling that something truly strange was happening settled in my chest. I decided then to try something else. I opened the door of the store, although I was sure it would be closed, but to my surprise it opened immediately. Cautious, I entered. The air was heavy, full of silence. I began to walk around the store, calling out loud, waiting for some answer, but there was none. I went to the counter area and, jumping on it to look back, I realized that the store had no signs of life. The bathroom, the warehouse, and a small office room were empty. Everything was in its place, but there was no one, as if time had frozen that place in an unshakable stillness. Being completely sure that something strange was happening, I took out my mobile phone and with trembling hands dialed the emergency number, not knowing very well what to do. I tried to explain the situation. "There is no one here," I told the operator. She at first thought it was a complaint about the service, but when she heard my tense voice, she began to. He took me seriously. He asked me if it looked like an assault had happened at the place. At that point I remembered that I had no idea what might be going on, but the idea of a robbery started to spin in my head, and if someone had hidden, I thought, not knowing what else to do. I started thinking about all the possibilities. The police would probably take a while to arrive. Then, as a last resort, I went back to the parking lot and headed towards the dumpster next to the gas station, an area I hadn't checked before. Maybe somehow that would help solve the mystery. When I got close, the idea of opening the dumpster seemed absurd to me, but something prompted me to do it. I didn't know if I wanted to check something or just calm down with the idea that there wouldn't be anything strange. But when I opened it, I saw enough light to back away, as if I had touched something poisonous. I couldn't believe what I saw. Inside there were two bodies, all twisted and with dark stains on their clothes. One of them was somehow wearing the uniform of the gas station. The vision left me completely paralyzed. I could barely contain a scream of horror. "Oh my God!" I muttered as I took steps back, and the phone was still next to my ear. The operator asked me what was going on, and I was in a state of total panic. I answered her with a trembling voice, "They are in the dumpster. Oh my God, they are in the trash." The call to the police was a disaster. I couldn't stop shaking as I talked to the operator, and the horror of what I had just seen was still etched in my mind. The bodies twisted in a way that defied all logic. They haunted me with every second that passed. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, and the worst thing was that I couldn't wake up. What's going on here? I kept repeating to myself over and over again without finding answers. Shortly after I hung up the phone, I walked away from the container, quickly trying to calm myself, but my mind kept spinning the same image, those two bodies in that macabre state. A shiver ran down my spine, and without thinking about it, I headed towards the road to find some fresh air. My stomach, that seemed to be about to reveal itself at any moment, made me stop. I felt the pressure build up in my chest, as if the air itself had become dense. I couldn't take it anymore and vomited near the canita, finally releasing the tension that had been consuming me. I tried to organize my thoughts while watching the distant lights of the cars that they were passing by on the road. The feeling of being completely alone in the middle of nowhere made me feel more vulnerable than ever. I looked at my trembling hands as if the traces of what I had witnessed could be etched on my skin. In the distance, I saw the lights of a patrol car approaching, and although I knew the police were already on their way, the fear didn't go away. On the contrary, the patrol car seemed to increase. I arrived at the end of the road and two officers quickly approached. Seeing the expression on my face, they knew immediately that something was not right. After a brief conversation, I explained what had happened, while still looking at the ground. As if looking at it, I could find some logical explanation. One of the officers asked me a series of questions, and although I tried to be coherent, I could not help my voice trembling. It was as if everything that had happened could not be real. Finally, the officer to whom I calmly explained what happened told me that I could leave, but to stay available to give more details if necessary. I felt as if I had been fired, as if my presence was not relevant at that moment. However, as I walked away, I felt a strange sense of helplessness. They were going to check the gas station, and I couldn't stay anymore. I needed to get away, disappear from that place. Although I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else I didn't understand. When I returned home that night, the tiredness hit me like a wave. I threw myself on the bed, but sleep didn't come. It was as if my whole body was on high alert, and every noise or shadow made me jump. I didn't know if it had been a bad thing I dreamed, but the image of the body was still haunting my mind. The officers told me to contact me if they needed anything else from me, but for some reason I couldn't help but think that maybe in some corner of that gas station there were unsolved secrets. The next day, I tried to look for information about what happened. I searched the local news, and although I found some vague reports about disappearances in the region, there was nothing concrete. That Clara never gave me an explanation about the bodies or contacted me again. Everything seemed to fade away, as if it had never happened, as if the place itself had been erased from the collective memory. But inside, I knew something was not right. From that moment, I never stopped at a lonely gas station again. Not even if I was on the same road. There was something unsettling about it. Those desolate places, something that made me feel like I was playing with danger. As I approached, I never stopped wondering what had happened to those people and why there were no traces of anything. In the news or in the official reports, something told me that the case was not over, that the gas station kept dark secrets that should not be revealed. Sometimes when I drive at night, I feel the fear return, as if my curiosity will take me back to those dark places. Every time I pass near a lonely gas station, the same fear invades me, and I feel driven to accelerate, as if something was waiting for me, as if the darkness had something else to offer. As the days went by, normality began to return, but inside me something had changed forever. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened that night. The bodies in the container, the desolation of the gas station, the inexplicable disappearance of the employees. All that followed me like a shadow, and although I tried to distract myself, the restlessness did not fade. The nights were the worst. Every time I turned off the lights in my house, my mind was filled with distorted images, scenes that I could not understand. I told myself that everything had to do with a mystery much bigger than a simple disappearance or an assault. I decided to investigate further. I searched the internet again, but the results were always the same. Vague stories, rumors about the gas station, and some mentions of disappearances in the area, but nothing to explain what I had witnessed. It was then that I remembered something. The police never explained to me what happened to the bodies or how they had ended up in that container. The news had been disappeared from the local headlines as quickly as it had appeared. It was as if no one wanted to talk about it. My curiosity, however, didn't fade. I knew that something dark was hiding behind that gas station and the people who had somehow been involved in that strange occurrence. I couldn't let it go. That's when I decided to do something I never thought would bring back to the place. I wanted to find answers. Even if it meant facing my own fears, I waited several days before making the final decision. The idea of returning terrified me, but something inside me pushed me to do it. It was as if the mystery was calling me, or perhaps as if it was challenging me to face it face to face. I remember arriving at the gas station at dusk. The light was already weak and the wind was blowing strongly, raising dust in the air. The atmosphere was still more disturbing than it had been that first night when I arrived. I noticed that the gas station was closed as expected, but something in the atmosphere made me think that everything was not as desolate as it seemed. I decided to park my car near the same place where I had that night. I could feel the cold calling me to the bone, but I didn't back down. I had to know what had happened there. Although the mere thought of the bodies gave me goosebumps. I walked slowly towards the store. My breathing was faster than normal. As I got closer, I saw that the door was ajar, something that didn't make me feel like I was there. I was waiting for the tent, or what was left of it. Looked exactly the same as last time, however. As I crossed the threshold, the air inside seemed even denser. There was something in the stillness of the place that made my nerves stand on edge. The same feeling of abandonment enveloped me. But there was something different about the energy of the place, something expectant. My heart rages tightly as I walked through the space. The tent was empty just like last time, but I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. A shudder ran down my spine at the thought that maybe someone who shouldn't be there was watching me. The sound of my footsteps on the linoleum floor echoed like an endless echo, and every time I looked into the shadows that formed in the corners, I felt something moving in the darkness. I decided to investigate the area behind the counter, but I couldn't stop my mind from playing tricks on me. It seemed as if the walls themselves were breathing as I reached the small room at the back where I had previously seen the bathroom and the storage room. The door was closed. Without thinking too much, I pushed it carefully. The room was empty, at least as far as physical objects were concerned, but something strange was there. The air was permeated with a smell of damp, as if something had been left to rot in that place. I looked around, and in a corner I saw something that made me stop dry. A small piece of cloth. I thought it might be a piece of clothing that someone had left behind, but as I got closer I saw that it was more than that. It was a piece of what appeared to be a gas station uniform, that same uniform that the body that had been on it was found in the container. An icy sensation ran through me instantly. The connection between the two events was evident. There was something else behind those bodies, something that the police hadn't discovered at the time. A question began to become part of my thoughts, like a kind of mantra. And if it was never an assault, and if this was all planned? Fear paralyzed me for a second. I knew I shouldn't be there longer. The air seemed to become thicker and an unbearable pressure was building up in my chest. I decided to leave quickly. But just as I turned towards the door, I heard a sound, a thud, like a slight thump coming from the back of the store. My blood froze instantly. I was not alone, my soul on tenterhooks. I turned to the door with a speed that surprised myself, but before leaving I stopped. For a moment, something told me that I should leave, but also that I should not forget what I had discovered. Something was not yet resolved. The sound came from somewhere inside the store, but I could not say exactly where. My instinct told me that I should flee, that I should leave immediately and not look back, but fear had me trapped motionless. The echo of my own heartbeat resonated with me in my ears. As the once dense air grew even heavier, the feeling that something wasn't right took hold of every corner of my being. Shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, as if the tent itself was coming to life. There was no logical reason to stay there, but there was something in me, a desperate curiosity that wouldn't allow me to take a single step towards the exit without looking again. I decided to move towards the sound. Despite everything, each step I took felt heavier than the last, as if the floor was absorbing my energy. I reached the back of the store where the empty shelves and flickering lights created an eerie atmosphere. It was then that I saw something that made me stop in dry. In the darkest corner next to one of the walls there was a figure. A completely visible person, but rather a shadow, a silhouette that blurred. My action accelerated instantly. I couldn't see clearly if it was human or something else, but the simple fact that it was there without making a sound filled me with indescribable anguish. A cold sweat covered my forehead while my legs trembled, unable to move, as if terror had completely paralyzed me. I felt that I was being watched by that shadow. I was studying myself, and although I couldn't see his eyes, I knew it. I knew that I was not alone, that something else was there with me. At that moment everything I had experienced so far seemed to make sense. It was not only the gas station that was desolate, but something much deeper, something related to the place, to the people who had worked there and to the people who had disappeared. I remembered the bodies in the container, the dark stains on their clothes, and the feeling that something had been hidden was not an accident or a simple crime. There was something darker, something that had been happening in that place long before I arrived, without realizing it. A shiver ran through my body and a voice inside my head told me that I should get out of there right now. However, when I took a step back, something changed. The shadow moved and a low, almost imperceptible sound filled the air. It was like a whisper, a murmur of distant voices, as if the deaths had never gone away, as if the people who had worked there were trapped in that place, doomed to repeat their fate over and over again. In an impulse of despair, I turned and ran to the door. Terror had completely invaded me, and the need to escape was overpowered. I had become primordial when I opened the door. An icy wind whipped my face, and I could see the light of the road, so distant but so close at the same time. I ran away without looking back, as if darkness itself was trying to devour me. When I got to the car, the fear did not disappear as I started the engine. My hands were still shaking and my eyes swept around the place with distrust, as if something was watching me from the shadows. I knew that I could never forget what I had lived in that place, the sound of those voices, the figure in the darkness, the bodies in the container. Everything would haunt me for the rest of my life. As I left the gas station, a strange feeling invaded me, the feeling that all this had been part of something much bigger, something that was beyond my comprehension. The disappearances, the bodies, the strange behavior from the gas station, everything seemed to be connected in a way I couldn't understand, but something told me that it wouldn't be the last time I'd hear about this place. As I walked away, a thought was on my mind: and if what I saw that night wasn't an accident, and if that gas station is just one more place in a web of dark events that are far beyond the realm of the world that we can imagine. I never went through that road again. I never stopped at a lonely gas station again. Something inside me told me that those places were cursed, marked by a dark destiny that I could never unravel. Something told me that the shadows that inhabit those places would never let their victims escape. The darkness I found that night never disappeared, and every time I passed near a lonely gas station, something in my chest it tightens as a reminder that the mystery has not been solved and perhaps never will be.